But the shadow of the Pharaoh's decree, the decree that had condemned his people to unending labor, was a persistent darkness that even the brightest desert sun could not fully dispel. It was a psychological burden, a constant reminder of the unaddressed injustice that festered in the heart of Egypt. He knew that his exile, while self-imposed in its finality, was a direct consequence of his rage against that injustice. He had struck out, a single, ill-considered blow against an entrenched system of oppression, and the consequence had been his flight. Now, in his self-imposed solitude, he wrestled with the uncomfortable truth that his personal safety had been prioritized over the collective suffering of his people. He would often find himself staring towards the west, towards the direction of the distant, fabled land of Egypt. His mind would conjure images of the mighty Nile, the lifeblood of that ancient civilization, now a conduit for his people's tears and sweat. He imagined the grand palaces, the bustling marketplaces, the opulent temples, all built by the forced labor of the Israelites. The very stones of those magnificent structures seemed to cry out with the silent anguish of his kin. The weight of their unspoken pleas, their desperate hope for deliverance, pressed down on him, a burden heavier than any he had carried in his gilded past. There were moments, fleeting and intense, when the peace he had cultivated felt like a betrayal. He would be watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fire and amethyst, and the image of a lash striking flesh would flash through his mind. He would hear, in the rustling of the wind through the dry brush, the faint echo of a cry of pain. These were not mere memories, they were intrusive thoughts, sharp and visceral, that shattered his carefully constructed tranquility. They were the voices of his conscience, refusing to be silenced by the vastness of the desert or the gentle bleating of his sheep. He understood, with a clarity that was both liberating and terrifying, that his life in Midian, while offering him personal peace, was incomplete. It was a life lived in the shadow of an unfulfilled obligation. He had escaped the consequences of his rashness, but he had not escaped the fundamental moral imperative that had driven that rashness in the first place. The same fire that had compelled him to strike out against the oppressor still flickered within him, now banked low, smoldering beneath layers of self-preservation and the comforting routine of his pastoral life. He would look at his staff, worn smooth by his grip, and it felt less like a shepherd's tool and more like a symbol of his detachment. It was an instrument of his present livelihood, but it was also a stark contrast to the symbols of power he had once wielded, and more importantly, the symbols of liberation that his people desperately needed. He had traded the scepter for the crook, the palace for the tent, the prince for the shepherd. And while there was a certain humbling nobility in this transformation, a profound lesson learned in the crucible of hardship, it was incomplete. He had learned to survive, to care for the vulnerable in his immediate charge, but the larger flock, the people of Israel, remained in bondage, their cries unheard by the distant prince-turned-shepherd. The psychological impact of this distant suffering was profound. It created a constant internal dissonance. The serenity of his Midianite life was always tinged with the melancholy of his people's plight. It was like a beautiful melody played with a single, sour note, a harmony that was perpetually off-key. He found himself oscillating between a deep appreciation for the quietude and a simmering discontent, a feeling that his life, while peaceful, was fundamentally misdirected. This internal conflict was a constant, low-grade fever, a persistent unrest that kept him from fully embracing the present. He was living two lives in one, the outward life of the contented shepherd, and the inward life of the haunted exile, a man torn between the desire for personal peace and the growing, undeniable sense of a call to something more. The Pharaoh's shadow was long, and it stretched even to the furthest reaches of Midian, casting its oppressive pall over Moses' soul, a constant, silent accusation. Chapter 6. Confrontation in the land of Goshen. The twilight, usually a time of quiet contemplation for Moses, was deepening into a profound stillness. The vast expanse of the Midianite wilderness, a canvas of ochre and umber under the fading light, offered a familiar, comforting silence. His flock, a gentle mass of wool and soft bleating, had settled for the night, their contented murmurs a balm to his soul. He was leaning on his staff, the familiar weight a grounding presence, his gaze drifting towards the eastern horizon, a ritual he often performed, a silent acknowledgement of the distant land that still held a piece of his fractured life. But tonight, something was different. A light, an unnatural luminescence, began to bloom in the gathering darkness, drawing his attention away from the familiar landscape. It started as a faint flicker, easily dismissed as a trick of the eye, a reflection from a distant star or perhaps a peculiarity of the twilight. But it grew, intensifying with an impossible vibrancy, coalescing into a single, brilliant point of pure, unadulterated light. It emanated from a clump of acacia bushes, their thorny branches usually stark and unassuming against the desert floor. Now, they were bathed in an ethereal glow, a radiant halo that pulsed with a life of its own. Moses, a man accustomed to the stark realities of the desert, a man who found solace in the tangible and the predictable, felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine. This was no natural phenomenon. As he drew closer, drawn by an irresistible, almost magnetic pull, the light resolved into a breathtaking spectacle. A single bush, no larger than any other, was engulfed in flames. Not the hungry, destructive flames of a wildfire, but a contained, almost gentle conflagration that seemed to burn with an inner light. The fire danced, shimmering and alive, yet the leaves of the bush remained miraculously green, unfurled and untouched. The branches, though surrounded by inferno, were not scorched, not blackened. The heat, he realized with growing astonishment, was barely perceptible, a soft warmth that kissed his skin rather than searing it. It was a fire that consumed without destroying, a paradox that defied all logic, all experience. He stood frozen, his shepherd's crook falling from his nerveless fingers to thud softly on the sand. His breath hitched in his throat, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The air around the bush seemed to hum with an invisible energy, a palpable presence that resonated deep within his bones. He had witnessed storms, the fury of sandstorms that could strip flesh from bone, but this was something entirely different. This was a power that spoke of a different order of existence, a force that dwarfed any earthly might he had ever known. His mind, usually so clear and rational, reeled. Was he dreaming? Was this some hallucination brought on by the desert heat, a figment of his solitary imagination? But the light was too real, too potent, too profoundly present. The silence of the desert was suddenly amplified, becoming a profound, expectant hush. It was as if the very earth held its breath, waiting. The bleating of his sheep had ceased, a collective stillness falling over the flock as they too, senses honed by instinct, sensed the extraordinary unfolding before them. Then, from the heart of the blaze, a sound began to emerge. It was not a crackle of fire, not the whisper of wind. It was a voice that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere at once, a sound that bypassed his ears and resonated directly within his soul. It was a voice of immense power, yet imbued with a tender resonance that sent shivers, not of fear, but of a profound, almost overwhelming reverence, through him. Moses, the voice called. The sound of his name, spoken in such a fashion, struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was a sound that held the weight of ages, the resonance of creation itself. He flinched, instinctively recoiling from the intensity of the divine address. His name, his human name, spoken by this impossible entity, was both terrifying and strangely familiar, as if he had been waiting to hear it spoken in this way all his life. He sank to his knees, the rough sand a sudden comfort against his trembling limbs. His eyes, wide with a mixture of awe and terror, remained fixed on the burning bush, the source of this unearthly voice. Moses, the voice repeated, each syllable imbued with a profound significance that stripped away all his defenses, all his carefully constructed peace. Moses. He could not speak, could not formulate a response. His throat was constricted, his mind a whirlwind of incomprehension and raw emotion. He felt exposed, utterly vulnerable, as if the very fabric of his being was being laid bare before this all-consuming presence. The years of exile, the quiet solitude, the carefully cultivated peace, all of it seemed to crumble and fade in the face of this undeniable manifestation. He had sought refuge from the world, from the complexities of his past, from the demands of his heritage. But here, in the desolate heart of the wilderness, the world, in its most primal and powerful form, had found him. His thoughts raced, a jumbled torrent of questions and fears. Who was this? What was this? He was a man who had walked in palaces, who had been raised in the very heart of Egyptian power, a man who had witnessed grand ceremonies and humbling rituals. Yet, nothing he had ever experienced, nothing he had ever seen or heard, prepared him for this. This was a power that was absolute, a presence that was all-encompassing. He felt the weight of his own insignificance, the smallness of his mortal existence in the face of such cosmic grandeur. He remembered the stories, the ancient tales passed down through generations, stories of God speaking to his ancestors, of divine interventions that shaped the destiny of nations. But those were tales, legends whispered in the dark, events that belonged to a distant past. He had never imagined, in his wildest dreams, that such an encounter would befall him, a simple shepherd, a man who had fled from his responsibilities, a man who had sought to bury his past in the quiet anonymity of the wilderness. The irony was not lost on him, a bitter tang that mingled with the sweetness of awe. The fire continued to burn, a silent, radiant testament to the divine presence. It was a beacon in the encroaching darkness, a stark contrast to the mundane reality he had known. He could feel the energy emanating from it, a vibrant, pulsating force that seemed to invigorate the very air he breathed. It was a paradox of overwhelming power and gentle invitation, a terrifying spectacle that simultaneously drew him closer. He felt a primal urge to flee, to retreat to the safety of the familiar, to shut his eyes and pretend this was not happening. But another, stronger impulse held him captive, a profound sense of destiny, an undeniable recognition that his life, as he knew it, had just irrevocably changed. "Draw no nearer," the voice commanded, its tone shifting, becoming firmer, more authoritative, yet still carrying that undercurrent of profound compassion. "Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." The words struck Moses with a fresh wave of shock. Holy ground. He looked down at his feet, clad in worn leather sandals, the same sandals he wore every day as he traversed the dusty plains. They were common, unremarkable, as was the ground beneath them. But the voice, the divine voice, declared it holy. And in that declaration, in the undeniable power that radiated from the burning bush, Moses understood. The ordinariness of the moment had been transformed by the extraordinary presence of God. With trembling hands, he began to unfasten his sandals. Each buckle felt stiff, cumbersome, as if his fingers had forgotten their purpose. The rough leather, once a source of protection and comfort, now felt like a barrier, an unnecessary impediment to his connection with this sacred space. As the last buckle loosened and the sandal slipped from his foot, the cool, dry sand of the desert floor met his bare skin. It was a sensation both alien and deeply grounding. The coolness was a sharp contrast to the radiant warmth of the bush, a tangible connection to the earth that was now declared holy. He remained on his knees, his head bowed, his body still vibrating with the residual shock of the encounter. The voice, however, had fallen silent, leaving Moses alone with the burning bush and the profound realization of his surroundings. The silence that followed was not an empty void, but a pregnant stillness, filled with the unspoken weight of divine revelation. He could feel the divine presence still, a subtle hum that permeated the air, a gentle pressure on his spirit. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence that demanded introspection, a silence that invited understanding. He looked up again, his gaze tentative, reverent. The fire still burned, a constant, unwavering flame. It was a symbol, he knew, a testament to a power that was eternal, unyielding, and yet, capable of manifesting in the most humble of forms. He thought of his flock, their simple needs, their uncomplicated lives. He thought of his own life, the quiet routine, the deliberate withdrawal from the world. And he understood, with a dawning clarity, that he had been found, not in his quietude, but in the very act of his seeking. He had been seeking peace, seeking solace, seeking an escape from his past. But he had been found by a purpose far greater than his own. The terror that had initially gripped him had begun to recede, replaced by a profound sense of awe and a burgeoning, albeit reluctant, sense of readiness. This was not an encounter to be dismissed, not a vision to be forgotten. This was a summons, a call to action. He, Moses, the son of Israel, the adopted son of Egypt, the fugitive shepherd, had been singled out. The weight of that realization settled upon him, not as a burden, but as a mantle. It was a heavy mantle, woven with the threads of his people's suffering and the promise of their liberation. He knew, with an certainty that defied all logic, that his life in Midian, the peace he had so carefully cultivated, was now a thing of the past. The wilderness, which had been his sanctuary, had become a stage for a divine confrontation. He had come to this desolate place to escape his past, to find quietude, to heal. But he had found something far more profound, a destiny that transcended his personal desires, a mission that called him back to the very source of his pain, to the land he had fled. The burning bush, a symbol of divine power and holy ground, had ignited not just fire, but a fire within his own soul, a fire that would consume his past and forge him into something new. The call had been unmistakable, and he, Moses, could no longer turn away. He was marked, chosen, and the journey ahead, though shrouded in uncertainty, had irrevocably begun. The silence of the desert now held the echo of a divine mandate, a whisper that promised both immense challenge and unimaginable promise. The silence after the divine pronouncement was a palpable thing, a heavy blanket woven with the threads of awe and utter disbelief. Moses remained on his knees, the cool sand a stark reminder of his bare feet and the hallowed ground beneath him. The image of the burning bush, a persistent inferno that refused to consume, was seared into his mind's eye, a testament to a power that defied every law of nature he had ever known. He had witnessed the might of Egypt, the grandeur of its temples, the sheer force of its armies. But this was a different order of power altogether. It was ancient, primal, and it had just called him by name. "Send me, you want to send me." The words, when they finally came, were a strangled whisper, barely audible even to himself. They were laced with a tremor that spoke not of excitement, but of a deep, soul-shaking fear. His mind, still reeling from the overwhelming presence, struggled to grasp the enormity of what had just transpired. He, Moses, the one who had fled his own people, who had sought solace in the quiet anonymity of the wilderness, was being asked to stand before the most powerful empire on earth and demand their release of a people he had not seen in decades. It was absurd. It was impossible. His thoughts, a tumultuous sea, churned with 1,000 reasons why this was a monumental error. He remembered the day he had struck down the Egyptian, the act that had sent him fleeing into this very desert. The shame of it, the guilt, still clung to him like a shroud. He was a man of violence, a man who had failed in his first attempt to champion his people. How could he possibly succeed now? "Who am I," he stammered, the words catching in his throat, "that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" The question was not rhetorical, it was a desperate plea, a raw confession of his profound inadequacy. He could feel the weight of his past pressing down on him, each failure, each misstep magnified in the face of this divine commission. He was not a leader. He was not a speaker. His tongue, he knew, had always been clumsy, his words often failing to convey the thoughts that swirled within his mind. He thought of the Egyptians, their arrogance, their cruelty. He imagined himself standing before Pharaoh, stammering, fumbling, a spectacle of incompetence. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through him. "And who am I to speak for you, Lord? I cannot even speak properly to men." The burning bush remained, a silent, incandescent witness to his distress. The voice, however, resumed, its tone not of impatience, but of a deep, unwavering understanding. It was a voice that seemed to cradle his fear, to acknowledge his humanity, without allowing it to derail the divine purpose. "I will be with you," the voice declared, the promise resonating with an authority that transcended his own limitations. "And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." The words, "I will be with you," were a balm to his tormented spirit, a lifeline tossed into the turbulent waters of his doubt. It was not his strength, not his eloquence, that would be the deciding factor, but the presence of the one who had called him. This was a concept he had always understood abstractly, a truth he had held in his heart during his years of exile. But to hear it spoken directly, as a promise tied to this monumental task, was something entirely different. It shifted the focus from his own failings to God's immeasurable power. Yet, the ingrained fear, the deep-seated belief in his own inability, persisted. He saw not the mountain where they would worship, but the towering walls of Pharaoh's palace. He heard not the promise of future worship, but the mocking laughter of Egyptian guards. He thought of the Israelites, their years of suffering, their potential to resist even divine intervention. What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, "The Lord did not appear to you?" He pleaded, his voice cracking with the weight of his apprehension. It was a cascade of what ifs, each one a testament to his conviction that he was the wrong man for the job. The divine response was a demonstration of power, a subtle yet devastating shift in the ordinary. God commanded Moses to throw his staff to the ground. He did so, his hands still trembling. Instantly, the staff transformed, writhing like a serpent, its scales shimmering with an unearthly luminescence. Moses recoiled, a cry of alarm escaping his lips. This was no mere trick, it was a manifestation of the very forces that governed creation, now being wielded with a casual grace. "Reach out and grasp it by the tail," the voice instructed, a calm counterpoint to Moses's racing heart. Hesitantly, almost against his will, Moses obeyed. As his fingers closed around the serpent's tail, the terrifying creature once again became his simple wooden staff. The transformation was instantaneous, inexplicable, yet profoundly real. It was a miracle, performed not for a crowd, but for him, a solitary shepherd in the vastness of the desert. The voice continued, "Then they will believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." This was the first tangible sign, a demonstration of power designed to overcome the skepticism he feared. But Moses's anxiety was a stubborn vine, already deeply rooted. He imagined the Israelites, weary eyes, their hardened hearts, their potential to dismiss even this astonishing display. Then came the second test, a chilling revelation of God's intimate knowledge of the natural world and his dominion over it. "Now put your hand inside your cloak," God commanded. Moses complied, his fingers brushing against the rough wool. When he withdrew his hand, it was covered in a leprous whiteness, a stark, horrifying affliction. He stared at it in disbelief and dread, his flesh crawling. "Now put it back into your cloak," the voice instructed. Again, Moses obeyed, and when he pulled his hand out, it was restored, as healthy and whole as before. The contrast was stark, the implications profound. This was not merely a show of power, it was a demonstration of life and death, of sickness and healing, wielded by the one who held ultimate authority. "If they do not believe you or listen to the first sign," God explained, "they may believe the second." But Moses's pleas were not yet exhausted. His stammering tongue, the source of his deepest insecurity, remained a formidable obstacle in his mind. He voiced his concern again, his voice thick with despair. "Oh, my Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and of tongue." He saw himself utterly failing to articulate the divine message, to inspire his people, to command respect from the Egyptians. The response from God was one of profound grace and unwavering resolve. There was no chastisement, no impatience, only a gentle but firm affirmation of divine sovereignty. "Who gave man his mouth?" the voice inquired, the question hanging in the desert air. "Who makes him deaf or dumb? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will be with your mouth and teach you what to say." This was the ultimate reassurance. It was not that Moses would suddenly become eloquent. It was that God would work through his limitations. The very organ of his perceived weakness would become a conduit for divine truth. The Lord would be his voice, his words, his message. The burden of eloquence was lifted, replaced by the certainty of divine inspiration. The fear of failure was confronted by the promise of divine partnership. A profound quiet settled over Moses. The frantic energy of his fear began to subside, replaced by a dawning comprehension. He was not being asked to perform miracles on his own. He was not being asked to become someone he was not. He was being asked to be a vessel, to open himself to a power far greater than his own, and to trust that this power would guide him, strengthen him, and speak through him. The burning bush, still ablaze, seemed to pulse with a gentle affirmation, the flames no longer terrifying, but reassuring. The raw, untamed power of the desert had been sanctified, and in its heart, Moses, the hesitant shepherd, was being forged into an instrument of divine will. The journey ahead was still shrouded in uncertainty, the challenges immense, but for the first time, a flicker of resolve ignited within him, fueled by the unwavering promise, "I will be with you." He understood then that his inadequacy was not a disqualifier, but an invitation for God's power to be made manifest. The fear remained, a shadow at the edge of his newfound resolve, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was now a reminder of the divine presence that would carry him through. The rough wood of the staff felt familiar in Moses's grip, the smooth, worn surface a testament to years spent guiding sheep across these parched lands. It was a simple tool, a shepherd's companion, a symbol of his quiet, unassuming life. He had never imagined it could be anything more. But now, as he stood before the incandescent glory of the burning bush, he was being asked to believe that this very staff, this mundane object, could become an instrument of unimaginable power. "Throw it to the ground," the voice commanded, the words resonating not just in his ears, but deep within his very bones. It was a directive that defied all logic, all reason, all that he knew of the natural order. His hands, accustomed to the gentle tug of a ewe's wool or the firm grasp on a stray lamb, hesitated. The weight of the staff suddenly felt immense, laden with an unknown potential. Yet, the presence that spoke was an irresistible force, a current pulling him forward despite his innermost resistance. With a sigh that was more a surrender than a sound, he released his grip. The staff tumbled through the air, a familiar arc against the stark backdrop of the desert sky. But as it struck the sand, the transformation was instantaneous, violent, and utterly terrifying. It did not merely lie there, it writhed. The wood seemed to liquefy, to twist and contort with a life of its own. Scales, shimmering with an unearthly, phosphorescent glow, rippled across its surface where smooth bark had been moments before. The familiar shape elongated, thickened, and a head, small and distinct, emerged, flicking a forked tongue. It was no longer a staff, it was a serpent, a sinuous, powerful creature of the desert, its very presence radiating an ancient, primal energy. Moses stumbled backward, a choked gasp escaping his lips. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, profound silence that had fallen. The air crackled with an unseen energy, the scent of ozone mingling with the dry, earthy fragrance of the desert. His eyes, wide with a terror he had never known, were fixed on the creature. This was not a trick of the light, not an illusion conjured by the heat. This was real, a tangible violation of everything he understood. He had seen serpents before, venomous vipers that slithered through the scrub, their movements swift and deadly. But this was different. There was a majesty to its form, a terrifying beauty to its illuminated scales. It moved with a fluid grace that spoke of raw power, of forces unbound. The sheer impossibility of it all threatened to overwhelm him. He was a shepherd. He dealt with the predictable, the tangible, the creatures that obeyed the laws of nature. This serpent, born from his own staff, was an affront to that order. It was a living embodiment of the impossible, a testament to a power that dwarfed any earthly authority he had ever encountered. His mind, still reeling from the voice in the burning bush, struggled to process this new, bewildering spectacle. Was this a test, a warning, or was it, as the voice had promised, a sign? He remembered the words, "And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you." The voice had spoken of signs, of demonstrations of power to convince his people. But had it meant this? Had it meant that his humble shepherd's staff, the very tool that symbolized his ordinary existence, would be transmuted into a creature of myth and fear? The implications were staggering. If such transformations were possible, then what else lay within the realm of this divine power? The serpent coiled on the sand, its luminous scales casting an eerie glow that seemed to deepen the shadows around the burning bush. It regarded Moses with unblinking eyes, a silent, potent observer. Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in his gut. He was accustomed to the dangers of the wilderness, to the swift action required to protect his flock from predators. But this creature, born of divine will, was beyond his understanding, beyond his ability to control. "Reach out and grasp it by the tail," the voice instructed, its tone calm and steady, a stark contrast to the tempest raging within Moses. The command was a renewed assault on his senses, a call to confront the very object of his terror. His hand, still trembling, felt leaden. The distance between him and the serpent seemed to stretch, each grain of sand a barrier. He could feel the residual heat radiating from the bush, a constant reminder of the extraordinary presence that orchestrated this bewildering scene. His mind raced, conjuring images of fangs, of venom, of the agonizing death that awaited anyone foolish enough to approach such a creature with fear in their heart. Yet, beneath the fear, a nascent curiosity, a desperate need to understand, began to stir. If this was a sign, then he had to see it through. He had to witness the full extent of its power, to understand its purpose. Slowly, painstakingly, he took a step forward. The serpent remained still, its serpentine body a marvel of unnerving beauty. Another step. The air grew warmer, charged with an almost palpable energy. His hand, outstretched, felt awkward, alien. He could feel the eyes of the creature upon him, though he could not discern any expression on its scaled face. It was a confrontation of the impossible, a solitary man facing a miracle made manifest. His fingers brushed against the cool, strangely smooth surface of the serpent's tail. It felt solid, real, yet impossibly altered. He tightened his grip, the scales yielding slightly under his touch. Then, with a surge of raw, instinctual will, he pulled. The transformation was as swift and shocking as its initial creation. The writhing serpent seemed to dissolve, to fold back upon itself, its luminous scales vanishing as if they had never been. In his hand, once again, was the familiar weight of his shepherd's staff. The wood was warm, as if it had absorbed the heat of the desert sun, but otherwise, it was just a staff. The serpent, the miraculous, terrifying serpent, was gone. Moses stood there, breathing heavily, the staff clutched tightly in his fist. His knees felt weak, his legs trembling. He looked from his hand to the sand, where no trace of the creature remained, then back to the burning bush. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breaths and the distant whisper of the wind. This was the sign. This was the proof. The staff, his staff, had become a serpent and then returned to its original form. It was a display of power that defied all natural law, a demonstration of authority over the very fabric of existence. His heart, which had been pounding with terror, now began to beat with a different rhythm, a mixture of awe, wonder, and a dawning comprehension. He looked at the staff, no longer just a tool of his trade, but a potent symbol. It had been touched by the divine, transformed by a power he could barely fathom. It was a reminder that even the most ordinary objects, when imbued with divine purpose, could become instruments of extraordinary change. This humble piece of wood, stained with the dust of the wilderness, was now inextricably linked to his destiny, a constant reminder of the impossible that had just occurred. The implications settled upon him with a profound weight. If God could transform his staff into a serpent, then surely he could equip Moses with the words, the authority, the strength he so desperately lacked. This miraculous event was not just a demonstration for some distant audience, it was a personal validation, a powerful reassurance directed at his own faltering spirit. He had doubted his ability to speak, his capacity to lead, his very worthiness for the task. But this was an undeniable testament to the power that would accompany him. He imagined holding the staff before the people, before Pharaoh. He saw the flicker of doubt in their eyes, the skepticism that would greet his words. And then, he saw the staff transformed, the serpent uncoiling, its luminous scales catching the light, its forked tongue tasting the air. He saw the fear, the astonishment, the undeniable recognition of a power beyond human comprehension. This sign was not merely about transforming a staff, it was about transforming belief, about shattering doubt with the undeniable force of the miraculous. The serpent, though gone, lingered in his mind's eye, a vivid, indelible image. It was a creature of myth and dread, yet it had been born from his own hand, guided by a divine voice. It represented the terrifying potential that lay dormant, waiting to be unleashed. It spoke of a power that could inspire fear, yes, but also awe, and ultimately, belief. The staff, once a symbol of his solitary life, now represented a bridge between his humble past and the monumental future that awaited him. It was a promise, a tangible embodiment of the divine presence that would walk with him, that would speak through him, that would transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. He tightened his grip on the staff, the familiar wood now feeling strangely charged, a conduit for the power that had so recently been revealed. The fear had not entirely vanished, but it was now mingled with a burgeoning sense of purpose, a quiet resolve born from witnessing the impossible. The desert sun beat down relentlessly, a familiar warmth that Moses had always associated with the quiet solitude of his flocks. But now, it felt different, charged with an unseen energy, a precursor to the monumental task that lay before him. He clutched the shepherd's staff, its familiar weight a comfort, yet it also served as a constant reminder of the terrifying, awe-inspiring encounter at the burning bush. The voice, echoing still within the chambers of his mind, had commanded him to return to Egypt, to confront Pharaoh, and to deliver his people from bondage. But the same voice, acknowledging the tremble in his voice and the stammer that so often plagued his words, had also revealed a crucial element of his mission: his brother, Aaron. The journey back towards the fertile lands of Goshen was a blur of anticipation and apprehension. He carried with him the weight of divine revelation, the memory of a staff transformed into a serpent, and the daunting prospect of facing a hardened Pharaoh. But more than anything, he carried the promise of Aaron's presence, a promise that served as both a beacon of hope and a source of his own deep-seated anxieties. He knew Aaron's character well, his warmth, his natural charisma, his ability to connect with people. These were qualities he felt he himself lacked, qualities that God, in his infinite wisdom, had deemed essential for this undertaking. As he drew closer to the settlements where his people had found a precarious refuge, a sense of nervous excitement began to bubble within him. He pictured Aaron's face, the familiar lines etched by years of living under oppressive rule, but also the inherent kindness that always shone through his eyes. Would Aaron understand? Would he accept this sudden, divine mandate, this seemingly impossible task of confronting the most powerful ruler in the known world? Moses's own faith, though strengthened by the signs he had witnessed, was still fragile, buffeted by the persistent winds of his own self-doubt. He found Aaron tending to a small flock near the outskirts of the settlement, a scene that mirrored so many years of their shared past. The sight of his brother, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon sun, stirred a profound emotion within Moses. It was a mix of relief, anticipation, and a poignant awareness of the years that had separated them. Aaron, engrossed in his work, did not notice his approach until Moses was but a few paces away. Aaron, Moses's voice, still hesitant, carried the echo of his ingrained insecurity. Aaron straightened, his eyes widening in disbelief as he recognized the familiar, yet strikingly changed, figure before him. The years in Midian had weathered Moses, etched a certain gravitas onto his features, but there was an undeniable aura of authority that had settled upon him, something that spoke of encounters beyond the ordinary. Moses. Aaron's voice was a mixture of surprise and hesitant joy. He dropped his staff and hurried forward, his arms opening in a gesture of embrace. The brothers met, a long hug that spoke volumes of unspoken longing and the shared history that bound them. It had been so long. So many years of separation, of wondering, of praying. As they pulled apart, Aaron's gaze lingered on Moses, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. You look different, brother. What has happened? Where have you been? Moses's heart, which had been pounding with a mix of nerves and affection, stilled for a moment. This was it, the moment of truth. He could feel the weight of the divine commission pressing down on him, urging him forward. He knew he couldn't falter now, not when Aaron was here, his brother, his appointed voice. Aaron, Moses began, his voice gaining a measure of steadiness, though a slight tremor still betrayed his inner turmoil. I have come from God. He has seen the suffering of our people in Egypt, and he has heard their cries. Aaron listened intently, his brow furrowed with a mixture of concern and a growing sense of wonder. He had always respected Moses, even admired his quiet strength and his deep sense of justice. But this sounded like madness, like a fevered dream. God, Aaron repeated, his voice laced with a disbelieving awe. Moses, what are you saying? I am saying that God has chosen me, has sent me back to Egypt to lead our people out of slavery. Moses paused, taking a deep breath. He has commanded me to go to Pharaoh and demand that he let our people go. Aaron stared at him, his mind struggling to reconcile the Moses he knew with the man standing before him, speaking of divine mandates and impossible feats. But, Pharaoh, he is a king, Moses. A powerful, unyielding king. And you are a shepherd. How can we, stand before him? This was the crux of it, the very reason for Aaron's inclusion. Moses knew he had to convey the divine plan, the specific role God had ordained for his brother. God has foreseen this, Aaron. He knows my limitations. He knows that my tongue is not swift, that my words often falter. And he has appointed you. Moses's gaze met Aaron's, filled with a newfound conviction. God has said that you shall speak for me. You will be my mouth, and I will be as God to you. You will take this staff, this rod that God has given me, and you will perform signs before Pharaoh. Aaron blinked, a slow understanding dawning in his eyes. He looked at the staff Moses held, a simple piece of wood, weathered and worn. He had seen Moses carry such a staff for years. He remembered their youth, their shared dreams under the vast, starry skies. Now, to be told that this simple object, and by extension, he himself, was to be an instrument of God's will. It was overwhelming. You mean, I am to speak to Pharaoh? Aaron's voice was hushed, a mixture of trepidation and a dawning sense of responsibility. Yes, Aaron, you will speak the words God gives us. I will stand beside you, and you will be my voice. God has promised that he will be with us, that he will guide our words and our actions. Moses extended the staff towards his brother. This staff, he continued, his voice gaining a powerful resonance that Aaron had never heard before, was shown to me by God. He transformed it into a serpent before my eyes, and then back into a staff. It is a sign, Aaron. A sign of his power, a sign that he has sent me. Aaron's gaze fixed on the staff, then back to Moses's earnest face. He saw not madness, but a profound conviction, a certainty that transcended the ordinary. He had always been the more outgoing, the more comfortable in his own skin. He understood people, their hopes, their fears, their unspoken desires. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was the reason. Perhaps his own gifts, his own voice, were meant to complement Moses's, to amplify the message that God was sending. Hesitantly, Aaron reached out and took the staff. It felt solid and real in his hand, yet as he held it, he felt a strange warmth, a subtle hum of energy that seemed to resonate within him. He looked at Moses, his heart filled with a mixture of awe and a budding sense of purpose. You truly believe this, Moses? Aaron's voice was softer now, the disbelief replaced by a growing acceptance. I have seen what I have seen, Aaron. I have heard what I have heard. God has chosen us. He has given us this mission. We cannot refuse. Moses's eyes, usually so filled with a quiet thoughtfulness, now burned with an unyielding resolve. Think of our people, Aaron. Think of their suffering. God has heard their cries. He is going to deliver them. And he is using us to do it. The weight of their people's plight settled upon Aaron's shoulders. He had seen it firsthand, the backbreaking labor, the despair in their eyes, the constant fear of the taskmasters. He had prayed, as had everyone, for a sign, for a deliverer. And now, here stood his brother, claiming to be that deliverer, and asking him to be his voice. He looked at the staff again, and then at Moses. He saw the strength that God had instilled in him, the authority that emanated from his presence. And he saw his own role, not as a leader, but as a conduit, a translator of divine will. It was a terrifying prospect, but also, strangely, exhilarating. If God has indeed sent you, brother, Aaron said, his voice firming, then I will stand with you. I will be your voice. We will go to Pharaoh together. A profound sense of relief washed over Moses. He clasped Aaron's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of their shared destiny. "Thank you, Aaron. I knew you would understand. God has blessed us with this partnership." Their reunion, so long awaited, was now imbued with a divine purpose. They spent the rest of the day in earnest conversation, Moses recounting the full details of his encounters with God, the burning bush, the transformation of the staff, the weighty pronouncements. Aaron listened, his initial astonishment gradually giving way to a deeper understanding of the magnitude of the task ahead. He asked practical questions, his mind already grappling with the logistics of confronting Pharaoh, of rallying the Israelites, of facing the inevitable resistance. As dusk settled over Goshen, casting long shadows across the arid landscape, the two brothers sat together, the staff lying between them, a silent testament to the extraordinary events that had brought them to this point. The initial shock had subsided, replaced by a shared determination. Moses, the reluctant prophet, and Aaron, the eloquent spokesman, were ready to embark on the greatest journey of their lives. The next morning, with the rising sun painting the eastern sky in hues of orange and gold, they set out towards the opulent city of Memphis, the seat of Pharaoh's power. Moses walked with a steady gait, the weight of his mission balanced by the presence of his brother beside him. Aaron, his head held high, his gaze clear and focused, radiated a quiet confidence that Moses found deeply reassuring. They arrived at the sprawling palace complex, an edifice of stone and grandeur that seemed to dwarf anything Moses had ever known. Guards, clad in shining armor, eyed them with suspicion, their faces impassive. Moses felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach, but he looked at Aaron, and saw a reassuring strength reflected in his brother's eyes. "We are here to see Pharaoh," Aaron announced, his voice clear and resonant, carrying an authority that surprised even Moses. "We are messengers of the Lord, the God of Israel. He commands that you let his people go." The guards exchanged skeptical glances. The title, Lord, the God of Israel, was not one they recognized among the pantheon of Egyptian deities. And these two men, dressed in the simple garb of the oppressed Hebrews, claiming to speak for their God to the divine Pharaoh. It was an audacious claim, bordering on insolence. One of the guards, a burly man with a scarred face, sneered. "You expect to just walk in and demand an audience with His Majesty. You are Hebrews, slaves. You have no right to speak such blasphemy." "We speak not for ourselves, but for the Most High," Aaron replied, his voice unwavering. "And his command is absolute. Let his people go, or face his wrath." The guard scoffed, reaching for the hilt of his sword. "Wrath? The only wrath you should fear is ours, if you do not leave this place immediately." Moses, his heart pounding, felt a surge of fear, but before he could speak, Aaron stepped forward, holding up the staff. "You doubt our words? Then let God show you his power." With a deliberate movement, Aaron threw the staff to the ground at the feet of the guards. For a terrifying instant, nothing happened. Then, the wood began to writhe. It elongated, thickened, and scaled, shimmering with an unearthly luminescence, coalesced into a serpent. It was not a mere snake, but a creature of immense power, its head raised, its forked tongue flickering, tasting the air with a silent menace. The guards recoiled, their arrogance vanishing in a wave of primal fear. They had seen snakes before, of course. Egypt was rife with them. But never one like this, born from a simple staff, radiating such an aura of raw, divine power. The scarred guard stumbled backward, his hand falling away from his sword, his face pale with terror. "This is the sign," Aaron proclaimed, his voice ringing with newfound authority. "The Lord, the God of your slaves, has sent us. Now, take us to Pharaoh. Let him see this for himself, and let him decide if he will face the consequences of refusing the Most High." The guards, thoroughly shaken, no longer dared to object. They had witnessed something beyond their comprehension, a manifestation of power that dwarfed their own earthly authority. With a hurried, nervous deference, they ushered Moses and Aaron into the palace, their earlier scorn replaced by a palpable fear. As they were led through the opulent halls, past courtiers and officials who stared at them with a mixture of curiosity and disdain, Moses felt a quiet sense of triumph. Aaron, his brother, His voice had spoken with a power that transcended his own limitations. He had faced their initial dismissal with unwavering confidence, and the divine sign had silenced their doubts. This was just the beginning, a mere taste of the confrontation to come, but it was a victory nonetheless. They were finally brought before Pharaoh, a man who exuded an aura of supreme power and divine entitlement. He sat on his ornate throne, adorned in gold and precious jewels, his gaze imperious as he looked down at the two Hebrew men. He had been informed of their arrival, of the strange incident with the guards, and his expression was one of cold amusement, tinged with irritation. "Who are you, and what is this insolent demand you bring before me?" Pharaoh's voice was deep and commanding, accustomed to absolute obedience. "You speak of a God I do not know, a God who claims to send you to demand I release my workforce." Aaron stepped forward, the staff held firmly in his hand. Moses stood beside him, a silent, potent presence. "We are Moses and Aaron, servants of the Lord, the God of Israel," Aaron began, his voice clear and strong, resonating in the grand throne room. "And we come to you with a message from him. Let my people go, so that they may worship me." Pharaoh let out a short, sharp laugh, a dismissive sound that echoed through the chamber. "Worship you? Your people are slaves. They work for Egypt. They do not worship any God that commands me. Who is this, Lord, that I should obey him?" "He is the God of all creation," Aaron stated, his gaze locked with Pharaoh's. "The God who has seen the suffering of our people, who has heard their cries, and who has sent us to deliver them from this land of bondage." Pharaoh leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Bondage. They are well kept. They have food and shelter. They build great cities for me. This is their purpose, and I will not let them go. What power does your God have that he can make me do so?" Aaron did not flinch. He raised the staff, its polished wood catching the light. "The Lord God of the Hebrews has appeared to us. And he has given us a sign. Behold," he declared, and with a practiced movement, he threw the staff to the marble floor. Once again, the transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The wood writhed, scaled, and coiled, becoming the luminous serpent, its head raised, its forked tongue flicking towards Pharaoh. The room fell silent, a hushed gasp rippling through the assembled courtiers. The serpent seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy, its scales glowing with an unearthly light that cast an eerie glow upon the rich tapestries and gilded statues. Pharaoh stared, his imperious gaze fixed on the creature. For a moment, his face remained unreadable, a mask of royal composure. But Moses could see it, a flicker of unease, a subtle tightening around his eyes. This was not the casual dismissal he had expected. Then, as if on a prearranged cue, Pharaoh's own sorcerers and priests, men who prided themselves on their knowledge of arcane arts and their ability to replicate any divine feat, stepped forward. They had been present, observing the unfolding drama, and now they moved to demonstrate their own supposed power. Each of them threw down their staffs, and one by one, they too transformed into serpents, though none possessed the same luminous glow or the palpable aura of power that emanated from Aaron's creature. They were serpents, yes, but they seemed earthbound, their movements less fluid, their presence less commanding. Pharaoh's expression shifted. The unease began to recede, replaced by a triumphant smirk. He looked at Aaron's serpent, then at the ones his own men had produced. "And what is this?" he sneered, his voice regaining its arrogant tone. "Your God's serpent is impressive, I'll grant you. But my own wise men, my priests, can do the same. See, they too have brought forth serpents. Your God is powerful, perhaps, but no more powerful than the gods of Egypt. My decision stands. Your people will not go." A wave of disappointment washed over Moses. It was a setback, a cruel twist of fate. He had hoped the sign would be undeniable, that it would break Pharaoh's will instantly. But the sorcerers had replicated it, or so it seemed. He looked at Aaron, a hint of despair in his eyes. But Aaron remained steadfast. He understood that this was not the end, but merely the first act. He met Pharaoh's triumphant gaze with a steady one. "Your wise men have indeed brought forth serpents," Aaron acknowledged, his voice calm and measured. "But the Lord's power is not limited to mere imitation. Observe." Aaron then reached down and, with a deliberate, steady hand, grasped the serpent by the tail. As his fingers closed around it, the creature began to writhe, not in aggression, but in a swift, astonishing reversal of its transformation. The scales melted away, the form elongated, and in Aaron's hand, once again, was the familiar shepherd's staff. The miraculous serpent had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the simple wooden rod. A collective murmur of astonishment swept through the throne room. The sorcerers, however, had not been so quick, or perhaps they lacked the divine authority to reverse their conjurations. Their serpents remained on the floor, writhing in their serpentine forms, no longer under their control. Then, with a swift and terrifying surge of movement, Aaron's staff, now back in its original form, struck out. It seemed to leap from his hand, a blur of motion, and strike at the serpents that lay on the floor. In an instant, they were no longer serpents. They were gone, vanished, consumed. Pharaoh stared, his mouth agape. The smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of utter disbelief and growing fear. The implication was clear and undeniable. The God of the Hebrews possessed a power that far surpassed that of the gods of Egypt, a power that could create and destroy, a power that could not be mimicked or defied by mortal men. Aaron, his voice resonating with divine authority, spoke again. "Let my people go, Pharaoh. For if you refuse, the Lord will bring plagues upon you and your servants, and your entire kingdom. He will show you that there is no other God like him in all the earth." Pharaoh, shaken to his core, did not answer. He dismissed them with a curt wave of his hand, his gaze distant, his mind clearly reeling from the display of power. The absolute certainty that had characterized him moments before had been shattered. He had witnessed a miracle, a divine intervention, and the seeds of doubt had been sown deep within his heart. As Moses and Aaron left the palace, the weight of their accomplishment settled upon them. They had delivered their message, and they had provided the undeniable proof. The initial confrontation had been a success, a testament to the power of divine partnership. Moses, the man of few words, and Aaron, his eloquent voice, had faced the mighty Pharaoh, and for the first time, the king of Egypt had been made to tremble. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, with Pharaoh's hardening heart and the struggles of their own people, but they had begun. They had begun to deliver Israel. The sun, a fiery orb in the vast Egyptian sky, beat down upon the heads of Moses and Aaron as they began their trek towards the land of Goshen. Their feet, accustomed to the dusty trails of Midian, now carried them across a landscape increasingly marked by the signs of human toil. The air, once alive with the chirping of birds and the rustle of desert winds, grew heavy with the distant, rhythmic clang of hammers and the low murmur of countless voices, a symphony of labor that spoke of generations of hardship. Each step forward was a step deeper into the heart of their people's suffering, a journey fraught with the weight of divine command and the flickering hope of liberation. Moses walked with a resolute stride, his eyes fixed on the horizon, the image of the burning bush and the voice of God imprinted on his soul. The staff, now a familiar extension of his being, felt less like a shepherd's tool and more like a conduit of divine power. Beside him, Aaron moved with a different kind of energy, his shoulders squared, his gaze alert, his mind already strategizing the words that would need to be spoken, the arguments that would need to be made, the very essence of God's message that needed to be conveyed to a heart as hardened as Pharaoh's. The years of separation had dissolved, replaced by an urgent, shared purpose that bound them closer than blood. They were a stark contrast to the world they were entering. Their simple, sun-bleached garments spoke of a life lived closer to the earth, while the distant sprawl of Egyptian settlements promised a civilization built on the backs of their kinsmen. The very air seemed to hum with an unspoken tension, a palpable awareness of the oppressive regime that held their people in its iron grip. Every mile traversed was a mile closer to confronting not just a king, but an entire system of power, a deeply entrenched order that profited from the subjugation of a people. As they moved further into the agricultural heartland, the landscape began to transform. The arid scrub gave way to fertile fields, irrigated by the life-giving waters of the Nile. But even here, amidst the abundance, the signs of forced labor were evident. Men, their bodies gaunt and their faces etched with weariness, toiled under the watchful eyes of taskmasters, their movements dictated by the whip and the threat. Women, their hands roughened by endless labor, carried heavy burdens, their faces mirroring the resignation that had become a hallmark of their existence. This was the land of Goshen, and it was a land of bondage. Moses felt a lump form in his throat as he saw them, his people. He had envisioned this moment, rehearsed it in his mind countless times, but the reality was more profound, more devastating than any mental image. He saw the stooped shoulders, the vacant stares, the slow, monotonous rhythm of their lives. He saw the generations of suffering etched into their very beings. And he felt a surge of righteous anger, a fierce protectiveness that fueled the fire of his divine commission. Aaron, ever attuned to the pulse of human emotion, sensed Moses's inner turmoil. He placed a hand on his brother's arm, a gesture of silent solidarity. "They have waited for this, Moses," he said, his voice a low rumble, carrying the weight of their shared burden. "They have prayed for deliverance. And God has heard their prayers." "I know," Moses replied, his voice raspy. "But to see them like this, it makes the task ahead seem even more impossible." "Impossible is a word for men, Moses," Aaron countered, his gaze sharp. "God's word is truth. We carry his power. We carry his promise. Pharaoh may sit on his throne, surrounded by his armies and his sorcerers, but he is but a man. And against the might of the Lord of hosts, his power is dust." They continued their journey, their presence a ripple in the placid, yet oppressive, surface of Egyptian life. They were outsiders, Hebrews returning to a place of exile, a place where their very existence was considered a burden to the empire. They attracted curious glances, whispers that followed them like shadows. Some of the Israelites, catching sight of them, would pause in their work, their eyes widening with a mixture of disbelief and a cautious, nascent hope. They had heard tales, whispers of a divine intervention, of a man who had communed with God. But seeing Moses and Aaron, two figures embodying a stark contrast to their own despair, standing tall and purposeful amidst the desolation, was a powerful affirmation. As they drew closer to the main settlements, the air thickened with anticipation. Word of their arrival spread like wildfire through the sprawling labor camps and scattered villages. Whispers turned into hushed conversations, then into excited murmurs. For generations, they had toiled, their backs bent under the lash, their spirits crushed by the weight of Pharaoh's decree. They had offered their prayers, their tears, their very lives to a God they knew only through inherited stories and the faint echoes of a covenant. Now, it seemed, their prayers might finally be answered. They reached a gathering point, a dusty expanse where Israelites had congregated, drawn by the news of Moses's return. The air buzzed with a nervous energy. Faces, gaunt and weary, turned towards them, a sea of expectant eyes. The elders, their faces lined with the wisdom of hardship, stepped forward, their steps slow but deliberate. "Moses, is it truly you?" An elder, his voice raspy with age and disuse, asked, his eyes searching Moses's face for confirmation. Moses nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. "It is I, Aaron, and we have come from God. He has heard your cries." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. The simple words, spoken with such quiet authority, resonated deeply. Hope, long dormant, began to stir within their hearts. They saw in Moses and Aaron not just men, but emissaries of a higher power, harbingers of a promised dawn. Aaron stepped forward, his voice clear and strong, carrying over the hushed assembly. "The Lord, the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has seen your affliction. He has heard your groaning. And he has come down to deliver you. He has sent us to Pharaoh, to demand that he let you go." The words hung in the air, potent and electrifying. Deliverance. The word itself was a balm to their souls, a concept almost too wondrous to comprehend. For years, they had lived with the crushing certainty of their subjugation. The idea of freedom, of worshipping their God without fear, had become a distant dream, a tale told to children to keep their spirits alive. Now, that dream was being spoken aloud, by their own kinsmen, by men who carried the undeniable aura of divine commission. But alongside the burgeoning hope, fear also began to take root. Pharaoh was not a man to be trifled with. His power was absolute, his will unbreakable. The stories of his wrath were legend, whispered in hushed tones to deter any hint of rebellion. To challenge Pharaoh was to invite destruction. An older woman, her face a roadmap of sorrow, stepped forward, her voice trembling. But Pharaoh, he will not listen. He has made our lives a torment. How can two men, even if sent by God, stand against him? He will crush us all. Moses looked at her, his gaze filled with compassion, but also with an unwavering resolve. God has foreseen this, Mother. He knows Pharaoh's heart. He has given us the signs, the power, to show him that his will cannot be defied. He then held up the staff, its polished wood gleaming in the harsh sunlight. This staff is but a symbol. The power that flows through it is the power of the Almighty. We will go to Pharaoh, and we will demand his compliance. And if he refuses, the Lord will demonstrate his might in ways he has never imagined. Aaron continued, his voice a powerful counterpoint to Moses's quiet conviction. God has commanded us to speak his words. He has promised to stand with us. He has assured us that his power will be made manifest. We are his instruments, and through us, he will break the chains that bind you. The Israelites listened, their hearts torn between the desperate longing for freedom and the ingrained fear of their oppressor. They saw the conviction in Moses's eyes, the steady strength in Aaron's voice. They felt the stirring of something ancient within them, a faith that had been tested by fire and forged in the crucible of suffering. The journey towards Pharaoh's palace was not merely a physical one, it was a descent into the very heart of their people's anguish. With each step, Moses and Aaron were met by more of their brethren, drawn by the unfolding miracle. The gatherings grew larger, the murmurs louder, the hope more pronounced, yet the fear remained a potent undercurrent. They saw families separated by labor assignments, individuals broken by years of servitude, children who had never known a life free from the shadow of the taskmaster. It was a tapestry of despair, and it fueled their determination. They spoke to the elders, to the foremen, to the women who toiled in the fields. They shared the divine message, the promise of liberation, and the signs that would accompany their plea. Some received the message with overwhelming joy, tears streaming down their weathered faces. Others, conditioned by years of harsh reality, remained skeptical, their hope tempered by a deep-seated weariness. They had seen false dawns before, promises broken, and the subsequent wrath of Pharaoh. How can we believe? A man asked, his voice etched with years of hardship. We have suffered for so long. Pharaoh's heart is like stone. And his sorcerers, they can do many things. Aaron met his gaze, his expression one of profound empathy. The sorcerers can mimic, but they cannot originate. They can borrow shadows, but they cannot command the light. The power we carry comes from the source of all creation. It is a power that can break stone, a power that can banish shadows. Have faith. God has not forgotten you. Moses, though quieter, projected an aura of unwavering certainty. He had seen the impossible happen. He had heard the voice that commanded the universe. He understood that their task was not just to confront Pharaoh, but to rekindle the dying embers of faith within his own people, to remind them of the God who had made a covenant with their ancestors. The path to Memphis, the grand capital city where Pharaoh held court, was long and arduous. They traveled under the relentless sun, their provisions sparse, their bodies weary. Yet, with every mile, their resolve deepened. They were no longer just two men, they were the embodiment of a divine promise, the vanguard of an exodus. They carried the hopes of an entire nation, a people yearning for the breath of freedom. As the sprawling city of Memphis loomed on the horizon, a monument to Egypt's power and wealth, a palpable sense of awe and trepidation settled upon them. The sheer scale of it, the grandeur of the architecture, the sheer number of people, it was overwhelming. This was the seat of Pharaoh's power, the heart of the empire that had enslaved their people. To stand before him, to demand the release of millions, was an act of audacious defiance that sent shivers down Moses's spine. Yet, as they walked through the bustling outskirts, they saw them, their people, toiling even here, constructing monumental edifices, their lives reduced to an endless cycle of labor. The sight fueled their determination. This was not just about Pharaoh, it was about every single Israelite suffering under the yoke of oppression. We are close now, Aaron said, his voice hushed, as they entered the city gates, the sounds of labor and commerce filling the air. The palace is within these walls. The taskmaster's whip may echo in Goshen, but here, we must face the king himself. Moses nodded, his gaze sweeping over the magnificent structures, the imposing statues, the sheer display of imperial might. He believes himself a god, Moses murmured, his voice barely audible above the din. He believes his power is absolute. We must show him the true power, Aaron. The power of the Most High. Their journey through the city was a surreal experience. They were figures of stark contrast against the opulence and grandeur of Egypt. Their simple robes, their weathered faces, their determined stride marked them as outsiders, as Hebrews. Guards, clad in polished armor, eyed them with suspicion, their expressions impassive. Courtiers, adorned in fine linen and gold, cast disdainful glances. But Moses and Aaron walked on, their purpose unwavering, their eyes fixed on the distant palace, the daunting edifice that housed the man who held their people's fate in his hands. They reached the palace gates, a monumental structure guarded by soldiers who seemed as unyielding as the stone itself. The air around them was thick with tension, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. This was the threshold, the point of no return. Behind them lay the suffering masses of Goshen, their hopes pinned on the outcome of this audacious confrontation. Before them lay the challenge of a lifetime, a task ordained by God, and the unwavering will of a pharaoh who saw himself as divine. The journey to the house of bondage was nearing its climax, the first act of a cosmic drama about to unfold. Chapter 7. The Wilderness and the Promised Land. The opulent throne room of Pharaoh shimmered with 1,000 gilded surfaces, each reflecting the dim, filtered sunlight that dared to penetrate the heavy curtains. The air was thick with the cloying scent of incense and the unspoken arrogance of absolute power. Pharaoh Ramesses II, a man whose name was etched into the very foundations of Egypt, sat upon his throne, his face a mask of regal indifference. His eyes, dark and piercing, fixed on the two men who stood before him, their simple linen robes a stark contrast to the silks and jewels that adorned his court. Moses, his face etched with the weariness of his divine commission, stood tall, his hand resting on the simple wooden staff that had become an extension of his being. Beside him, Aaron, his priestly robes a splash of symbolic color, met Pharaoh's gaze with an unwavering steady resolve. "We have come," Moses began, his voice, though quiet, carried a resonance that seemed to echo in the cavernous hall, "at the command of the Lord, the God of the Hebrews. He has seen the affliction of his people, and he demands that you let them go." Pharaoh's lips curled into a sneer. He leaned forward, his voice a low growl that vibrated with displeasure. "The God of the Hebrews? I know of no such God. I am Pharaoh, the son of Ra, the living embodiment of the divine. Who are you, a renegade prince and your priestly brother, to come before me with such insolent demands?" He gestured dismissively towards Moses. "You, the one who fled from my justice, now return with tales of a foreign deity. Preposterous." Aaron stepped forward, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the Pharaoh's bluster. "The Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has spoken. He is the God of all gods, the creator of the heavens and the earth. He has heard the cries of his people, and he will not suffer their bondage any longer. Therefore, we say to you, let my people go, that they may serve him in the wilderness." Pharaoh threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound that grated on the ears. "Let your people go. You are mad. They are my workforce, the very hands that build my monuments, that irrigate my fields. Their sweat is the mortar of my empire. To let them go would be to cripple Egypt. I have no knowledge of this, Lord God, you speak of, and even if I did, why should I obey him? Your God is weak, a mere tribal deity, while I am Pharaoh, supreme ruler of this land." He slammed his fist on the armrest of his throne. "Now, leave my sight before I have you both thrown into the dungeons for your insolence." Moses remained unmoved, his gaze steady. "Because Pharaoh refuses, the Lord will strike Egypt. You will know that I am the Lord, when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring forth plagues upon it. And the people will know that I, the Lord, have stretched out my hand against Egypt, and I will stretch out my hand against you and your servants, your people and your houses, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord." Pharaoh scoffed, "Plagues? What plagues can a desert god inflict upon the mighty Egypt? Your threats are as empty as your God's promises. Be gone." He waved them away dismissively, signaling his guards to escort them out. As Moses and Aaron turned to leave, Aaron felt a tremor run through his hand. He instinctively raised his staff, the one that had been a mere shepherd's crook, now imbued with a power he was still learning to comprehend. He followed Moses's gaze, their eyes meeting with a silent understanding. The divine command had been given. The confrontation had begun. They emerged from the palace into the blinding Egyptian sun, the grandeur of the royal court quickly fading behind them. The air, still and oppressive, seemed to hum with an unseen energy. They walked with a renewed sense of purpose, their mission not yet complete, but its first, monumental hurdle cleared. They had delivered the divine ultimatum. Now, they had to wait for Pharaoh's inevitable refusal. Back in the palace, Pharaoh Ramesses, though outwardly dismissive, felt a prickle of unease. The young Hebrew, so recently a prince, now a man touched by something otherworldly, had spoken with a conviction that gnawed at him. And Aaron, his brother, the priest, had wielded that staff with a strange, almost unnatural grace. But the unease was quickly buried beneath layers of pride and ingrained authority. He was Pharaoh. His will was law. No foreign god, no matter how boastful, could sway him. He had heard Moses's pronouncement of plagues, and he dismissed it as the desperate ramblings of a banished man. He would not let his people go. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the land, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere. A strange stillness descended upon the banks of the Nile. The lifeblood of Egypt, the mighty river that sustained its civilization, began to change. What had been a shimmering ribbon of life-giving water, teeming with fish and supporting a vibrant ecosystem, began to darken. A foul odor, like the stench of decay, filled the air, overpowering the usual earthy smells of the fertile banks. The fishermen, returning from their day's work, were the first to notice. Their nets, usually heavy with the bounty of the Nile, came up empty, or worse, filled with dead, bloated fish. Their shouts of confusion soon turned to cries of alarm. The water, once clear and life-sustaining, was now a sickly, blood-red hue. It was not merely colored, it was thick, viscous, and utterly devoid of life. The villagers along the riverbanks were in a panic. Children cried, their faces pale with fear, as they saw the once familiar waters transform into a horrifying crimson tide. The animals, too, sensing the unnatural corruption, refused to drink. The very air grew heavy with the stench of death. The news spread like wildfire through the kingdom. From the sprawling fields of the delta to the bustling cities, the people of Egypt looked upon their dying river with terror and disbelief. They had never witnessed such a phenomenon. The Nile was sacred, the source of their prosperity, their very existence. And now, it was turning into a putrid mire. Pharaoh, summoned to the banks of the river, stood aghast. His guards, normally stoic, recoiled from the stench. He looked at the blood-red water, his face a mixture of shock and fury. He had heard Moses's words, but he had dismissed them. Now, this abomination, was undeniable. He turned to his sorcerers, the wise men who had always held the keys to understanding the mysteries of the world, or at least, so he believed. "Explain this," he roared, his voice echoing across the unnatural silence of the blood-red river. "What sorcery is this? Who has dared to defile the sacred Nile?" The sorcerers, their faces pale and drawn, consulted their scrolls, mumbled incantations, and performed what little rituals they could under the suffocating atmosphere. But their words were hesitant, their pronouncements uncertain. They too, were bewildered by the sheer scale and unnaturalness of the event. They could produce illusions, mimic certain phenomena, but they could not conjure such a widespread, life-ending transformation. Finally, one of the chief sorcerers, a man named Hem, stepped forward, his voice trembling. "O Pharaoh, this is no ordinary affliction. The Nile, it has become blood. The fish are dead. The water is unfit to drink. This is a work of immense power, a power beyond our understanding." Pharaoh glared at him, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and rage. "Beyond your understanding. Then what use are you?" He then turned his gaze towards the direction of Goshen, his mind filled with the image of Moses and Aaron. "It is them," he seethed, his voice laced with venom. "It is that Hebrew sorcerer and his brother. They have done this." He sent for Moses and Aaron, his commands laced with a desperate urgency that belied his regal pride. They were brought before him once more, this time not in the throne room, but on the banks of the corrupted Nile, the stench of death a stark reminder of their words. "Moses," Pharaoh bellowed, his face contorted with fury. "You have done this. You and your God have turned my river into blood. You have brought death to Egypt. If you do not stop this at once, I will have you both torn limb from limb." Moses, his gaze steady and filled with a somber pity, met Pharaoh's rage. "It was not I, Pharaoh, but the Lord who has done this. He has heard the cries of his people, and this is his first sign. Let my people go, that they may serve him." Pharaoh's jaw tightened. He looked at the blood-red water, at the dead fish floating on its surface, at the terrified faces of his people. Yet, the thought of letting the Israelites go was still anathema to him. He saw the sorcerers, their heads bowed, unable to counter the divine display. But still, his pride would not yield. "I will not let them go," Pharaoh declared, his voice a strained whisper of defiance. "This is an inconvenience, nothing more. My sorcerers will find a way to cleanse the water. You will not dictate to me." And so, the sorcerers labored. They performed rituals, they chanted incantations, they drew upon their limited arts, and to their astonishment, and Pharaoh's grim satisfaction, they were able to draw water from deeper wells, or perhaps from some unseen, untainted source, that was not blood. They could not restore the Nile itself, but they could provide enough water for the Egyptians to survive. It was a hollow victory, a testament to their skill in mitigating disaster, but not in preventing it. The Nile, however, remained a festering wound, a constant reminder of the divine wrath. The Israelites, meanwhile, in Goshen, looked upon the events unfolding in Egypt with a mixture of awe and fear. They saw the signs, they heard the reports, and they knew that God was indeed acting on their behalf. But the scale of the devastation also filled them with a profound sense of unease. They were a part of Egypt, and the suffering of the Egyptians, though their oppressors, was still the suffering of fellow human beings. Days turned into a week, and the Nile remained blood. The stench grew more putrid, the flies more numerous, and the despair of the Egyptians deepened. The fish, a staple of their diet, were gone. The water, undrinkable, spread disease and fear. The prosperity of Egypt was crippled by this single, devastating plague. Pharaoh, seeing the mounting unrest and the undeniable power of the Hebrew God, was forced to concede. "Moses, Aaron," he commanded, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and desperation, "entreat your Lord to take away this plague from me, and from my people, and I will let you go, that you may offer sacrifices to the Lord your God in the wilderness. I will let you go, and you shall no longer oppress my people." Moses, his heart heavy with the burden of his mission, looked at Pharaoh. He knew the Pharaoh's heart was still hardened, his concession born of desperation, not true repentance. "Very well," Moses said, his voice grave. "I will entreat the Lord. But know this, Pharaoh, when I depart from you, you will know that there is none like the Lord our God. The blood will depart from the rivers, from the streams, and from the pots, but it will remain in the ponds and marshes. And the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord." Moses prayed, and as he did, the Lord turned to him, and the oppressive presence that had choked the land began to recede. The red hue of the Nile slowly, gradually, began to fade. The stench lessened, and the dead fish, though still numerous, began to sink. Life, sluggish and hesitant, began to return to the waters. The Egyptians rejoiced, believing the worst was over, that their sorcerers had indeed found a solution, or that Pharaoh's temporary concession had appeased the divine wrath. But Moses and Aaron knew better. They had witnessed the immense power of the Lord, and they knew that Pharaoh's heart had not truly changed. They had seen his pride, his arrogance, and his deep-seated refusal to acknowledge the supremacy of the God of Israel. As the Nile began to recover, Pharaoh's resolve, strengthened by the return of normalcy, hardened once more. He had been forced to bend, but he would not break. He had seen the plague depart, and in his eyes, that meant the threat was over. The Israelites would remain. Their labor was too valuable to forfeit. When Moses and Aaron appeared before him again, their demand echoing in the throne room, Pharaoh's face was once again a mask of defiance. "No," he declared, his voice ringing with renewed authority. "I will not let the people go." Moses and Aaron exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of the inevitable escalation. The Lord had warned them. Pharaoh's heart would be hardened. And now, the second plague was to descend. This time, it was not the water that was corrupted, but the very air that Egypt breathed. The frogs, usually confined to the marshlands and the deeper reaches of the Nile, began to emerge in unimaginable numbers. They swarmed out of the water, their croaking a deafening cacophony that filled the night. They hopped into the homes, onto the beds, into the food stores, their slimy bodies and cold, unblinking eyes a source of utter revulsion and terror for the Egyptians. The plague was relentless. Frogs were everywhere. They covered the land, they infested the houses, they choked the streets. The Egyptians, a people who valued order and cleanliness, were overwhelmed by this slimy invasion. Their revulsion turned to panic, then to despair. They tried to kill them, but there were too many. The sheer volume of the creatures was beyond comprehension. Pharaoh, even in his own chambers, was not spared. Frogs hopped across his floors, into his royal chambers, and onto his very throne. The stench of their decaying bodies began to permeate the palace. His pride was being systematically eroded by these tiny, amphibious creatures. He sent for Moses and Aaron again, his voice strained, the croaking of frogs a constant, maddening soundtrack to his plea. "Moses, Aaron, entreat the Lord to take away the frogs from me and my people, and I will let you go. I will let the people go, and they shall offer sacrifices to the Lord." Moses, his expression unchanged by Pharaoh's desperation, replied, "You must grant us leave to go and make sacrifices to the Lord our God. For when I depart from you, when I have entreated the Lord, you may know that there is none like the Lord in all the earth. The frogs will depart from you, your houses, your servants, and your people. They will remain only in the Nile." Pharaoh agreed, a flicker of hope returning to his eyes. Moses prayed, and the Lord heard him. The croaking subsided, the slimy bodies began to wither and die, and the Egyptians, with a grim determination, cleared away the vast swarms of dead frogs. The land, though still smelling faintly of decay, was free from the immediate horror. But as the last of the frogs withered away, Pharaoh's heart once again hardened. He had seen the plague depart, and his pride surged back, stronger than ever. He would not be dictated to by a banished Hebrew and his God. He had managed to survive the frogs. He could survive whatever else this God might throw at him. He refused to let the Israelites go. And so, the third plague descended, a plague that affected the very dust of the earth. Moses, again by divine command, struck the ground with his staff. And from the dust, swarms of gnats, or biting insects, emerged. They were relentless, a constant torment that burrowed into the skin, bit with agonizing intensity, and were impossible to escape. The Egyptians cried out in pain and frustration. They had been plagued by water and by amphibians, but this insidious torment of tiny, biting creatures, was unbearable. They covered themselves with cloth, they tried to burn them away, but the gnats were everywhere, a suffocating cloud of misery. Even the sorcerers, who had managed to mimic the plagues of blood and frogs, were helpless against this one. "This is the finger of God," they exclaimed to Pharaoh, their voices filled with a newfound fear and respect for the Hebrew God. "This is the power of the Almighty." Pharaoh, though visibly suffering, his skin red and irritated from countless bites, remained defiant. He could not deny the power, but he would not surrender his authority. He refused to let the Israelites go, and the plague of gnats continued to torment his people. The ensuing plagues were a symphony of destruction, each one more devastating than the last, each one designed to break Pharaoh's will and demonstrate the utter supremacy of the Lord over the gods of Egypt. The plague of flies, a thick, buzzing swarm that darkened the land and tormented man and beast alike. Then, a pestilence that struck down the livestock, killing all the cattle of Egypt, while the cattle of Israel remained unharmed. This stark contrast, a clear division between the chosen and the oppressor, was a blatant display of divine favor and power. Pharaoh, witnessing the decimation of his herds, his wealth, his very livelihood, was shaken. He sent for Moses and Aaron, his voice a choked whisper of despair. He offered to let the Israelites go, but only to offer sacrifices in Egypt, not in the wilderness, a compromise designed to keep them tethered to his land. Moses, however, knew that this would not suffice. The Lord's command was clear: they were to go into the wilderness and worship him. Then came the plague of boils, a painful and disfiguring affliction that broke out on both man and beast throughout Egypt, yet spared the land of Goshen. The Egyptians cried out in agony, their bodies covered in festering sores, their suffering immense. The sorcerers themselves were afflicted, their power rendered useless against this divine onslaught. Pharaoh, witnessing this new wave of suffering, his own body racked with pain, seemed to waver. He would allow the Israelites to go, he conceded, but begged Moses to intercede with God to end the torment. Moses prayed, and the Lord answered, but Pharaoh, true to his hardened heart, retracted his promise as soon as the pain subsided. The subsequent plagues were even more catastrophic. A devastating hailstorm, unlike any seen before, lashed the land. It was a tempest of ice and fire, stones falling from the sky, killing man and beast, destroying crops, and shattering the very infrastructure of Egypt. Only in Goshen, the land of the Israelites, did the hail not fall. This was a clear, undeniable sign of divine protection, a stark testament to God's covenant with his people. The Egyptians watched in horror as their fields were decimated, their homes destroyed, and their livestock perished. The fear of God, a concept that had been alien to them, began to take root. Pharaoh, his kingdom in ruins, his people in despair, was forced to admit, I have sinned. The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. He once again promised to let the Israelites go. But even this admission was short-lived. As soon as the hail ceased, and the destructive storm subsided, Pharaoh's hardened heart resurfaced. The fear of losing his labor force, the ingrained pride of his kingship, outweighed the terror of the divine plagues. He refused to let the Israelites go, and the stage was set for the final, most devastating plague. The eighth plague was that of locusts. Swarms of these voracious insects descended upon Egypt, devouring every green thing that the hail had left. They consumed the remaining crops, the fruits of the trees, the leaves on the branches. The land, once fertile and abundant, was reduced to barrenness, stripped bare by the insatiable appetite of the locusts. The Egyptians looked upon this devastation with a profound sense of hopelessness. Their food supply was gone. Starvation loomed. Pharaoh, seeing the utter devastation of his kingdom, finally seemed to break. His advisors, themselves desperate and terrified, urged him to let the Israelites go. He summoned Moses and Aaron, his voice trembling, and declared, I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Now, therefore, forgive my sin, only this once, and entreat the Lord your God, that he may take away from me this death only. He still clung to the hope that Moses could somehow control the divine wrath, a testament to his enduring pride. Moses, however, knew that this was not merely about appeasing a wrathful deity. It was about liberation. He knew that Pharaoh's repentance was shallow, his promises fleeting. As Moses went out from Pharaoh, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart once more, a divine decree ensuring that the exodus would proceed as ordained. And so, the ninth plague descended, a plague that plunged Egypt into an unnatural, suffocating darkness. It was not the darkness of night, but a palpable, oppressive gloom that swallowed the sun, the moon, and the stars. The Egyptians, accustomed to the life-giving light of their sun god Ra, were plunged into terror. They could not see their hands before their faces. They stumbled in the darkness, their screams echoing through the silent, lightless cities. This was a direct assault on their very belief system, a demonstration that their sun god was powerless against the Lord of hosts. The darkness lasted for 3 days, a suffocating eternity for the Egyptians, while the Israelites in Goshen enjoyed light in their dwellings. This was the ultimate testament to the power of the Hebrew God, a power that could extinguish the very source of Egyptian life and worship. Pharaoh, trapped in the suffocating darkness, his kingdom plunged into chaos, finally capitulated. His pride was shattered, his authority undermined, his people terrified beyond measure. He summoned Moses for the final time, his voice a hoarse whisper in the oppressive gloom. "Go, serve the Lord your God. But leave your flocks and herds behind." Moses, his voice filled with a solemn authority, met Pharaoh's desperate plea with a resolute stance. "You are mistaken, Pharaoh," he declared, his words echoing in the unnatural silence. "Not only will I go with our young people and our old people, with our sons and our daughters, but also with our flocks and herds, because you are to us an army of our own. We will not leave a hoof behind. It is by the Lord's command that we go, and by his command that we take all that is ours." The darkness began to lift as Moses spoke, revealing the terrified faces of Pharaoh and his court. The Egyptians, blinking in the returning light, saw the desolation around them, the lingering stench of death, the palpable fear in their own hearts. But now, they also saw the unwavering resolve in Moses and Aaron, the certainty of their divine mission. Pharaoh, defeated, broken, and stripped of his pride, could only watch as Moses and Aaron turned and walked away, the weight of their monumental task now shifting from confrontation to liberation. The 10 plagues, a testament to God's power and Pharaoh's stubbornness, had paved the way for the Exodus, the beginning of a new chapter for the Israelites, and the irreversible decline of Egyptian dominion. The test of wills had concluded, and the Lord's victory was absolute. The air in Goshen, usually thick with the scent of sheep and the earthy aroma of cultivated fields, now thrummed with an unnatural tension. Whispers, once hushed and fearful, now crackled with a desperate energy, carrying the news that had swept through the Hebrew settlements like a wildfire. Pharaoh had finally relented. The chains of bondage, forged over centuries, were to be broken. The word, freedom, was no longer a forbidden dream whispered in the darkness, but a tangible possibility, a promise carried on the wind. Yet, as the divine pronouncement reached the ears of every man, woman, and child, a peculiar duality of emotion settled upon them. Hope, bright and exhilarating, warred with a primal fear, the ingrained dread of a people who had known only the iron fist of oppression. The pronouncement of the final plague, the chilling decree of the death of the firstborn, had been the ultimate catalyst. It was a horror so profound, so indiscriminate, that it finally shattered the impregnable fortress of Pharaoh's pride. The screams of the Egyptians, the wails of fathers and mothers mourning their lost heirs, had echoed across the land, a symphony of despair that even the most hardened heart could not ignore. Pharaoh, stripped bare of his godlike facade, his kingdom in ruins and his people decimated, had finally succumbed. His command, delivered with a voice cracked by grief and terror, had been stark: "Go. Serve your God." But even in his desperation, a shadow of his old self lingered, a futile attempt to retain a semblance of control. "But leave your flocks and herds behind," he had declared, his words a desperate plea to hold on to at least a fraction of what he believed was his. Moses, his face a mask of solemn authority, his heart heavy with the weight of the centuries of suffering he was now to rectify, had met Pharaoh's desperate ultimatum with unwavering resolve. "You are mistaken, Pharaoh," he had declared, his voice echoing in the unnaturally silent palace, the oppressive darkness that had gripped the land finally beginning to recede, as if in response to the pronouncement of liberation. "Not only will I go with our young people and our old people, with our sons and our daughters, but also with our flocks and herds, because you are to us an army of our own. We will not leave a hoof behind. It is by the Lord's command that we go, and by his command that we take all that is ours." With those words, the last vestiges of the suffocating gloom dissipated, revealing the terrified faces of Pharaoh and his court, the desolation of their kingdom laid bare in the returning light. The Israelites, emerging from their homes in Goshen, were met with a scene of unprecedented pandemonium. The word had spread like wildfire, and the air was thick with the frantic energy of a people on the cusp of an unimaginable journey. Families, their faces etched with a mixture of elation and disbelief, scrambled to gather what they could. Children, their eyes wide with wonder and a touch of apprehension, clutched meager possessions, their usual games replaced by the urgent, collective task of departure. Men, their muscles still bearing the ache of years of forced labor, hefted bundles of bedding and tools, their movements swift and purposeful, driven by an instinct to flee before the fragile reprieve shattered. Women, their faces illuminated by the pale dawn, rushed to gather provisions, their hands moving with practiced efficiency, packing dried figs, coarse bread, and waterskins, the scant provisions that would sustain them on an unknown path. The livestock, sensing the shift in atmosphere, stirred restlessly, their bleating and lowing adding to the cacophony of the exodus. The sheer scale of the movement was breathtaking. It was not a disciplined march, but a surging tide of humanity, a river of people and animals flowing out of Goshen, their destination uncertain, their hearts filled with a potent cocktail of hope and terror. The elderly, their bodies frail but their spirits resolute, were supported by younger generations, their faces turned towards the east, towards a horizon that held the promise of something entirely new. Young mothers, their infants nestled securely in their arms or swaddled on their backs, pushed through the throng, their eyes fixed on the path ahead, a silent prayer for their children's future echoing in their hearts. Young men, their youthful energy brimming, helped to guide the recalcitrant livestock, their shouts and gestures adding to the general din. There was a palpable sense of urgency, an unspoken fear that Pharaoh's concession was as ephemeral as the morning mist. Each moment of delay felt like a risk, a chance for the old chains to snap back, for the soldiers of Egypt to descend upon them. The memories of the plagues, the vivid images of darkness, locusts, and death, were still fresh in their minds, a stark reminder of the power they were escaping, and the potential for retribution. The Exodus was not a triumphant parade, it was a desperate flight, a chaotic scramble for freedom before the opportunity vanished. As they streamed out of the land of Goshen, their familiar fields and homes receding behind them, a profound realization settled upon many. They were leaving behind the only lives they had ever known. The oppressive familiarity of Egypt, its harsh laws and cruel masters, was still a part of their collective memory. The Nile, the source of both their toil and their sustenance, now flowed through their past, a symbol of their long and arduous servitude. The very stones of their temporary dwellings, though built under duress, held a history, a testament to their endurance. The initial hours of the journey were a blur of frantic activity. There was little time for reflection, only the relentless drive to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the land of their bondage. They moved in a disorganized yet determined mass, a testament to the raw power of collective will. The elders, their faces etched with the wisdom of years, urged them onward, their voices often lost in the general clamor. Aaron, his priestly robes a splash of color against the dusty throng, moved among his people, offering words of encouragement and prayer, his presence a steadying force in the midst of the swirling emotions. Moses, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, his hand gripping his staff, felt the immensity of the moment. He was not just leading an escape, he was ushering a nation into existence, birthing a people out of the crucible of oppression. The sheer number of people was astounding. Estimates whispered among the elders suggested a population in the hundreds of thousands, not including the vast herds of cattle, sheep, and goats that followed in their wake, their presence a testament to the prosperity they had managed to eke out even in their enslaved state. This was not a small band of rebels, this was a multitude, a nation on the move. The ground beneath their feet trembled with the passage of so many feet and hooves. Dust billowed around them, creating a hazy shroud that obscured the rising sun, a sun that now seemed to shine on them with a new, benevolent light. As the day wore on, and the initial frenzy began to subside, a different kind of emotion began to surface. The adrenaline of the escape gave way to the stark reality of their situation. They were in the wilderness, a vast, unforgiving expanse of sand and rock, with no clear path and no guaranteed destination. The whispers of the promised land, of milk and honey, were still just that, whispers, tales of a future that felt as distant and uncertain as the stars. Doubt began to creep into the hearts of some, a gnawing fear that this newfound freedom was merely a prelude to a different, perhaps even more perilous, form of suffering. The children, their initial excitement waning, began to cry from hunger and fatigue. The elderly, their strength failing, had to be carried or supported by others. The animals, unused to such a prolonged and arduous trek, grew weary, their bleating turning to mournful cries. The vastness of the desert, which had seemed so inviting from the confines of Egypt, now loomed as an insurmountable obstacle. The sun beat down relentlessly, baking the sand and raising the temperature to unbearable levels. Water, so readily available from the Nile, now became a precious commodity, each sip carefully rationed. The immediate realization of their vulnerability began to set in. They were exposed, their numbers a potential target for any who might choose to pursue them. The memory of the Egyptian army, its chariots and soldiers, a terrifying force that had once seemed insurmountable, lingered in the collective consciousness. Would Pharaoh, in his renewed anger, send his forces to reclaim his lost property? The question hung heavy in the air, a silent, unspoken fear that shadowed their steps. Despite the challenges, the spirit of unity and shared purpose was undeniable. Those who had a little shared with those who had nothing. Stronger individuals helped to carry the weaker ones. The elders, despite their own weariness, offered words of encouragement and guidance, drawing upon their long experience of life and hardship. There were moments of quiet contemplation, of awe at the sheer magnitude of what had transpired. They had been slaves, bound to the will of another. Now, they were free. The weight of that freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. As they ventured deeper into the wilderness, the landscape began to change. The fertile plains of Egypt gave way to rolling dunes and rocky outcrops. The air grew drier, and the vegetation sparser. The Israelites, accustomed to the abundance of the Nile Delta, found themselves grappling with a new environment, one that demanded resilience and resourcefulness. They had left behind a world of forced labor, but they were now entering a world that required an entirely different kind of strength, the strength to survive, to adapt, and to trust in a power that had delivered them from bondage. The first night in the wilderness was a stark contrast to the familiar comforts of Goshen. They made camp wherever they found a suitable place, huddling together for warmth and security. The stars, unobscured by the city lights of Egypt, blazed with an intensity that was both beautiful and daunting. The silence of the desert, broken only by the rustling of the wind and the occasional cries of nocturnal animals, was a profound and unsettling experience. For the first time, they were truly alone, with only their faith and their community to rely upon. This was not the end of their journey, but the beginning. The Exodus, the desperate flight from Egypt, was just the first step on a long and arduous path. The wilderness stretched before them, a vast unknown, a crucible in which their faith would be tested and their identity as a people forged. The hope of the promised land burned brightly, a beacon in the darkness, but the path to it would be fraught with peril, demanding a level of courage and perseverance they were only just beginning to understand. The fear of pursuit was real, the challenges of survival immense, but the taste of freedom, once experienced, was a powerful motivator, a driving force that propelled them onward, into the heart of the unknown, towards a destiny that was yet to be revealed. They were no longer slaves in Egypt, but a liberated people, a nation in transit, their future as uncertain as the shifting sands beneath their feet, yet filled with the incandescent promise of a divine purpose. The waters of the Red Sea, a monstrous wall held back by an unseen hand, now receded, revealing a bed of glistening sand and the scattered remnants of Egyptian chariots. The clang of metal on stone, the terrified screams of soldiers, and the triumphant roars of the Israelites had faded with the receding tide, leaving behind an eerie silence punctuated only by the lapping of the waves and the frantic bleating of livestock. Freedom had been won not by sword or spear, but by a divine decree that parted the very ocean. Yet, as the Israelites stumbled onto the eastern shore, their bodies aching from the ordeal and their hearts still thrumming with residual fear, the exhilaration of their miraculous deliverance was quickly tempered by a new, gnawing reality, the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Sinai wilderness. The land of Goshen, with its familiar if bitter bounty, was now an impossibly distant memory. Before them lay only sand, rock, and an endless, shimmering horizon that promised neither sustenance nor shelter. The initial days were a testament to the sheer, raw momentum of escape. They moved with a desperate urgency, driven by the lingering phantom of Pharaoh's wrath. The memory of the pursuing chariots, their wheels churning the seabed, their soldiers drowning in the collapsing waves, was a chilling spur. Moses, his staff still bearing the faint luminescence of the divine power that had commanded the sea, urged them onward. He felt the immense weight of their deliverance, the palpable gratitude that pulsed through the multitude, but beneath it, he sensed the tremors of a deeper unease. They had fled a known oppressor, but they had run into the arms of an unknown desolation. The promised land, a whispered legend of milk and honey, felt impossibly far, a distant star in the oppressive glare of the desert sun. The first true test came with the water. The brackish pools they found were a mockery of the life-giving Nile. Children cried with thirst, their small bodies already beginning to wilt under the relentless heat. The elders, their faces etched with a weariness that went beyond mere physical fatigue, pleaded with Moses. "Water, Moses, water." The cries echoed, rising from every quarter. "Do you bring us here to die of thirst, you and your God?" The accusations, sharp as shards of obsidian, pierced Moses's resolve. He saw the doubt blooming in their eyes, the desperate questioning of the very God who had just performed such a stupendous miracle. He felt the familiar weight of their fear, the ingrained suspicion that any divine intervention would inevitably be followed by a new, perhaps even more terrifying, hardship. He led them to a place where water was visible, a shimmering oasis in the distance, but when they reached it, they found it bitter. The air vibrated with their discontent. It was Mara. The bitterness was not just in the water, it was in their hearts, a taste of the old despair resurfacing. Moses, his heart heavy, cried out to the Lord. And the Lord showed him a tree. He took the tree and cast it into the waters, and the waters became sweet. A collective gasp went through the crowd as they drank, the cool, sweet liquid a balm to their parched throats and their anxious souls. Yet, even in this moment of relief, the murmurs persisted. "The Lord provides," some said, their voices tinged with wonder. But others, their eyes still reflecting the harshness of the desert, whispered, "This is a test. What will be next?" The manna. It was the Lord's response to their gnawing hunger. Each morning, a fine, flaky substance, like frost on the ground, would cover the desert floor. They had never seen anything like it. Its taste was described as like wafers made with honey. It was sustenance, pure and simple, provided by a power that seemed to understand their every need even as they voiced their complaints. But the people's nature, forged in the fires of oppression and accustomed to the harsh dictates of authority, struggled with this seemingly effortless provision. They were commanded to gather only what they needed for the day, but some, driven by a primal fear of scarcity, tried to hoard it. The next morning, their hoarded manna, intended to sustain them, was found to be full of maggots and stank. It was a stark lesson in trust, a divine reminder that their survival was not dependent on their own efforts to control, but on their willingness to rely on the daily provision of the Most High. Moses, tasked with enforcing these divine laws, found himself constantly mediating, explaining, and rebuking. The cycle was relentless, a period of divine intervention, followed by a human failing, and then Moses's weary task of intercession and instruction. The wilderness was a relentless teacher, its lessons etched in thirst, hunger, and the constant, gnawing fear of what lay beyond the next sand dune. The Israelites, stripped of their Egyptian masters, now faced a more profound master, their own ingrained habits of complaint and doubt. They had been slaves, their lives dictated by external forces. Now, freed from those chains, they were confronted with the daunting task of self-governance, of mastering their own desires and fears. Moses, more than any of them, understood the immensity of this challenge. He was the bridge between the divine and the human, the shepherd of a flock that was constantly straying, its bleating cries a mix of genuine need and petulant discontent. Their journey was not a straight line. The divine guidance, often conveyed through Moses, led them through a labyrinth of wadis and across desolate plains. There were moments of stark beauty, the impossibly vast, star-drenched nights, the sudden, fleeting bloom of hardy desert flowers after a rare shower, but these were fleeting respites from the overarching harshness. The sheer scale of their numbers, now numbering in the hundreds of thousands, became a logistical nightmare. Water sources, even when found, were quickly depleted. The livestock, essential for their sustenance, needed grazing, a precious commodity in this arid land. One such episode of discontent, fueled by thirst, occurred at Rephidim. The people, their tongues thick, their throats raw, once again turned on Moses. Why did you bring us out of Egypt to die here, with our children and our livestock of thirst? They demanded, their voices hoarse with desperation. Moses, his patience worn thin, cried out to the Lord, "What shall I do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord's answer was direct and powerful. He told Moses to take some of the elders of Israel with him, and to take his staff, the same staff that had struck the Nile, the same staff that had parted the Red Sea. He was to go to the rock of Horeb. "I will stand there before you, by the rock," the Lord declared. "Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." Moses, accompanied by the elders, approached the imposing rock. He raised his staff, the symbol of God's power and authority, and struck the rock. Not once, but twice. And from the clefts of the ancient stone, a torrent of clear, cool water gushed forth, cascading down the rock face, forming a pool, and then a stream, that flowed to quench the thirst of the entire camp. The people rejoiced, their anger and despair dissolving in the face of this fresh miracle. In that moment, they saw the power of God manifest before their eyes, a testament to his unfailing provision. Moses, however, felt the weight of the Lord's rebuke, a subtle but firm correction woven into the command. The Lord had said, "Strike the rock," implying a single, decisive act. By striking it twice, Moses had, perhaps unintentionally, shown a hint of impatience or doubt. It was a small thing, a mere detail in the grand tapestry of their deliverance, but it was a reminder to Moses, and to the people, that even in their moments of greatest need, they were to approach God with reverence and a complete trust in his divinely appointed ways. This incident, named Massah and Meribah, meaning, testing, and, quarreling, became a permanent scar on their collective memory, a reminder of their repeated failures to trust. The wilderness was also a place of spiritual testing. The Amalekites, a fierce nomadic tribe, saw the vulnerable stream of humanity and saw an opportunity for plunder. They attacked from the rear, preying on the stragglers, the elderly, the weak, the women and children. The chaos and terror of this attack were a stark contrast to the divine miracles they had witnessed. Moses, his heart filled with anguish, turned to Joshua, a strong and capable warrior, and commanded him, "Choose some of our men and go out and fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands." As Joshua led the men into battle, Moses ascended the hill. With him were Aaron and Hur. The battle raged below, the outcome hanging precariously in the balance. Moses, holding his staff aloft, raised his hands in prayer. As long as his hands remained raised, Israel prevailed. But as his arms grew weary and began to fall, the Amalekites gained the upper hand. Aaron and Hur, seeing this, came to Moses's side. One on each side, they supported his arms, holding them steady until the sun set. And under the unwavering gaze of Moses's prayer, Joshua and his men decisively defeated the Amalekites. It was a profound lesson. Victory was not solely won by the strength of arms on the battlefield, but by the persistent, unwavering intercession of the spiritual leaders, a testament to the truth that the unseen battles were often the most crucial. This victory, too, was a sacred inscription in their history, a reminder that their spiritual posture was as vital as their physical prowess. Days bled into weeks, and weeks into months. The initial shock of their miraculous escape had worn off, replaced by the grinding reality of their nomadic existence. The wilderness offered little comfort. Their tents provided scant protection from the searing sun and the biting desert nights. The constant dust coated everything, a gritty reminder of their exposed vulnerability. The journey was slow, marked by the needs of the very young and the very old, by the movement of countless animals, and by the unpredictable nature of the terrain. Moses found himself perpetually in a state of mediation. He was the voice of God to his people, and the voice of his people to God. He listened to their endless complaints, their fears, their doubts, their longing for the familiar, even if it was the familiar hardship of Egypt. He felt their constant internal struggle between the memory of oppression and the nascent stirrings of a free identity. He wrestled with their incredulity when miracles were performed, and their instant reversion to fear and complaint when the next hardship arose. It was a relentless cycle, a grueling test of his own faith and his own endurance. He would ascend the mountain, seeking divine guidance, and descend to face a people who seemed determined to test the very limits of divine patience. The divine interventions continued, the provision of water, the manna, the defeat of the Amalekites, but they became almost routine, their miraculous nature dulled by the constant tide of human frailty. The Israelites, having been delivered from physical bondage, were now grappling with the far more complex task of spiritual liberation. They had to unlearn the habits of generations, to replace the fear of the oppressor with the reverence for the Creator, to replace the instinct of self-preservation at any cost with the discipline of obedience and trust. Moses, in the quiet solitude of his tent or on the desolate slopes of Sinai, would often ponder the paradox of their journey. They had been chosen, set apart, delivered with a mighty hand. Yet, they seemed so prone to falling. He understood that this was not merely a physical journey from Egypt to Canaan, but a profound spiritual transformation. The wilderness was the crucible, designed to refine them, to strip away the dross of their former lives, and to forge them into a people worthy of the promises that lay ahead. He knew that the path was long, and that the greatest trials were perhaps yet to come. But in the midst of the dust, the thirst, and the murmurs of discontent, there was also the unwavering presence of the Almighty, a constant, guiding force that, however tested, would ultimately lead them to their destiny. The wilderness was a harsh schoolmaster, but its lessons, etched in the very fabric of their experience, were vital for the birth of a nation. The air grew heavy with an unspoken anticipation as the Israelites, their tents dotting the parched landscape, looked towards the towering peak of Sinai. It was a mountain unlike any they had seen, jagged, imposing, its summit often veiled in mist, giving it an aura of ethereal mystery. For weeks, they had journeyed through the unforgiving expanse of the wilderness, their lives a constant rhythm of divine provision and human complaint. They had drunk from miraculously sweet waters, been sustained by daily manna, and witnessed the miraculous scattering of their enemies. Yet, these were but preludes to the momentous event that was about to unfold. Moses, the shepherd of this wayward flock, felt the weight of the Lord's command settling upon him like the very dust of the desert. He was to ascend the mountain, to stand in the very presence of the Almighty, and to receive the laws that would bind this newly freed people into a covenant nation. As Moses began his climb, the world around him seemed to recede. The sounds of the camp, the cries of children, the murmur of conversations, faded into an indistinct hum. The path grew steeper, the rocks sharper, the air thinner. Each step was a deliberate act of faith, a journey away from the familiar, however harsh, towards the profoundly unknown. He carried with him the hopes and fears of a multitude, the hopes of a promised future, and the fears of a people still clinging to the vestiges of their servitude. His own heart pounded, a drumbeat against the immense silence, a mixture of awe and trepidation. He knew he was not merely climbing a mountain, he was ascending to a divine audience, a privilege few had ever, or would ever, experience. The higher he went, the more the atmosphere changed. A low rumble, like the distant rumble of a colossal beast, began to vibrate through the very stones beneath his feet. The sky, which had been a searing, uninterrupted blue, began to darken, not with the gentle approach of evening, but with an intense, almost palpable gloom. Wisps of cloud, unlike any he had seen, began to swirl and coalesce around the peak, tinged with an unnatural luminescence. The air grew charged, crackling with an unseen energy that raised the fine hairs on his arms and seemed to hum in his bones. He felt a profound sense of being both utterly alone and in the most intimate company imaginable. Then, it began, not with a gentle whisper, but with a cataclysmic roar that shook the very foundations of the earth. Lightning, not as fleeting streaks, but as blinding, sustained veins of pure fire, ripped through the darkened heavens, illuminating the swirling clouds in a terrifying, ethereal glow. Thunder, a relentless barrage of sound, hammered down, each peal deeper and more deafening than the last, echoing and re-echoing through the mountain's rocky canyons. Smoke, thick and acrid, billowed from the summit, obscuring it completely, creating an impenetrable veil between the earthly realm and the divine. It was a spectacle of raw, untamed power, a display that dwarfed any storm, any earthly commotion, into insignificance. This was not merely weather, this was the physical manifestation of the Creator's presence. Moses, though shaken to his core, pressed onward. He reached a plateau, a desolate expanse before the final, most shrouded ascent. Here, the Lord spoke to him, not in a voice that struck the ears, but in a resonance that vibrated directly within his soul. It was a voice that was simultaneously the gentle breeze and the hurricane, the still small voice and the thundering pronouncement. It was the voice of the one who had spoken to him from the burning bush, the one who had commanded the seas and provided the manna. "Tell the Israelites," the voice commanded, its power encompassing Moses completely, "you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." The weight of those words settled upon Moses, a profound understanding of his people's destiny, their unique calling. He was not merely to deliver them from slavery, but to forge them into something entirely new, a nation set apart, a beacon of divine will to the world. He felt the immense responsibility, the almost unbearable magnitude of this task. He was to be the mediator, the one who bridged the infinite chasm between the divine and the human. He returned to the edge of the camp, a profound transformation evident in his bearing. The people, huddled together, their faces etched with a mixture of awe and fear at the celestial drama unfolding above them, looked at him with a renewed sense of reverence. He conveyed the Lord's words, his voice steady, though he himself was still trembling from the encounter. The people, in unison, with a single, resounding voice, declared, "We will do everything the Lord has said." It was a declaration born of the raw power they had witnessed, a promise spoken in the shadow of God's might. But the Lord's purpose was not yet fulfilled. He instructed Moses to tell the people to sanctify themselves, to wash their garments and abstain from intimacy, for on the third day he would descend among them in full view. Moses conveyed these instructions, meticulously detailing the boundaries set around the mountain, a physical manifestation of the sacredness of the impending encounter. Anyone who touched the mountain, he warned, would surely die. The fear that had been present during the storm now intensified, tinged with the sanctity of this divine appointment. On the third day, as dawn broke, the mountain was once again enshrouded in smoke and fire. The thunder and lightning intensified, accompanied by the deafening blast of a ram's horn, growing louder and louder. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. It was an overwhelming sensory experience, a divine symphony of terror and majesty. Moses, with Aaron at his side, led the elders to the foot of the mountain, where they stood on the precipice of the divine encounter. And then, from the heart of the smoke and fire, the 10 Commandments were spoken. Not written, not dictated, but spoken by the very voice of the Almighty. Each word was a hammer blow, forging a new moral and spiritual framework for the nascent nation. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments." The impact of these words was profound. They established the absolute sovereignty of the one true God, rejecting the idolatry that had permeated so many of the surrounding nations, including, in part, the Egyptian culture from which they had been delivered. The prohibition against images was a radical concept, demanding a relationship with the divine that was based on faith and obedience, not on tangible representations. "You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name." This commandment spoke of the sacredness of the divine name, a reminder that God's identity was not to be invoked lightly, but with reverence and respect. "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner living in your community. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. The institution of the Sabbath was a divine gift, a rhythm of rest and worship woven into the fabric of their lives. It was a weekly reminder of God's creative power and a sanctuary from the relentless demands of labor, a space to reconnect with their Creator and with each other. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. This commandment established the foundational importance of family and respect for elders, recognizing that the strength of the nation began within the home. You shall not murder. A clear, unambiguous prohibition against taking human life, underscoring the sanctity of every individual. You shall not commit adultery. A command that protected the sanctity of marriage and the integrity of relationships, vital for the stability of the community. You shall not steal. A fundamental principle of justice and respect for property. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. This addressed the importance of truthfulness and integrity in interpersonal relationships, crucial for building trust within the community. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. This final commandment delved into the root of sin, addressing the internal desires that could lead to outward transgression, emphasizing the importance of contentment and gratitude for what one possesses. The pronouncement of these commandments was a moment of profound spiritual crisis and commitment for the Israelites. They had heard the voice of God directly, and the sheer power of it had terrified them. They turned to Moses and said, "Speak to us yourself and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die." They recognized their own frailty in the face of such overwhelming holiness. Moses, ever the intercessor, reassured them. "Do not be afraid," he said. "God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning." He understood that their fear was not merely a reaction to the sensory overload, but a healthy reverence for the divine. He then ascended again, deeper into the mountain, into the heart of the divine presence. This time, his encounter was more intimate, more prolonged. He spent 40 days and 40 nights on the mountain, in direct communion with the Lord. He was given not only the 10 Commandments, engraved on tablets of stone by the very finger of God, but also a vast array of detailed instructions for the construction of the tabernacle, the sanctuary where God's presence would dwell among his people. These were not mere architectural plans, they were blueprints for a covenant relationship. Every detail, from the type of wood to be used for the Ark of the Covenant to the colors of the threads for the priestly garments, was imbued with spiritual significance, designed to teach the people about holiness, atonement, and the pathways to approaching a holy God. He received instructions for the sacrificial system, the rituals that would allow for the atonement of sin and the maintenance of the covenant relationship. He learned about the roles and responsibilities of the priests and the Levites, who would serve as mediators between God and the people, facilitating worship and ensuring the proper observance of the law. He was given laws concerning justice, civil matters, and daily life, all designed to create a righteous and ordered society, a reflection of God's own nature. The time spent on the mountain was a period of intense spiritual formation for Moses. He absorbed the very essence of divine will, internalizing the principles that would guide his people. He was not just a messenger anymore, he was being transformed into the embodiment of the law, a living testament to the covenant. The desert had begun the process of stripping away their reliance on the familiar, but Sinai was the forge where their identity as a distinct people, bound by divine law and in covenant relationship with the Almighty, was being hammered into existence. The glory of God, which he had glimpsed in fleeting moments, was now a constant, overwhelming reality that permeated his very being. When he finally descended, his face was radiant, aglow with the divine light that had bathed him, a visible testament to the profound encounter he had experienced. The people, looking at him, saw not just their leader, but a man touched by the divine, a conduit through which the very will of God was being revealed. The Mount of Revelation was not just a place where laws were given, it was the place where the heart of a nation was being circumcised, where the foundation of their spiritual existence was being laid, stone by divine stone. The sun beat down with a relentless intensity that was as familiar as the dust on their sandals. 40 years. 40 years of scorching days and star-strewn nights, of marching and murmuring, of manna and miracles. Now, at long last, The horizon shimmered with a promise that had sustained them through generations of hardship, the Promised Land. From the vantage point of the eastern banks of the Jordan River, the land lay before them, a verdant tapestry woven with the hues of olive groves, vineyards, and fertile plains, a stark contrast to the barren wilderness that had been their home for so long. The air, once thick with the grit of the desert, now carried the faint, sweet scent of distant blossoms and ripening fruit. It was a scent that whispered of fulfillment, of a journey's arduous end. Yet, for Moses, the architect of this monumental exodus, the sight of the land was a double-edged sword. His eyes, dimmed by the passage of time and the countless tears shed for his people, took in the panorama with a mixture of profound satisfaction and an ache that settled deep within his soul. He had led them from the crushing yoke of Egypt, through the perilous Red Sea, across a vast and unforgiving desert, and now, he had brought them to the very threshold of their inheritance. The weight of his responsibility, a burden he had carried for 4 decades, was finally beginning to lift, yet with it came the heavy knowledge of a personal price. The words, spoken with a divine finality years ago, echoed in the quiet chambers of his heart. He would see the land, but he would not enter it. He stood slightly apart from the throng, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains that cradled the land of Canaan. The people bustled around him, their voices a chorus of excited anticipation, their faces alight with an hope that had been passed down from parent to child, a legacy of faith and perseverance. They spoke of flowing milk and honey, of cities already built, of enemies to be vanquished. Their energy was palpable, a collective surge of eagerness to finally plant their feet on solid ground, to build homes that would not be dismantled with the dawn. They saw Moses as their triumphant leader, the embodiment of God's deliverance. And in a way, he was. But he was also the one whose single act of disobedience, a moment of profound frustration and doubt at Meribah, had barred him from the very prize he had fought so hard to secure for his people. The memory of that transgression, though decades passed, still pricked at him. It was a moment when the rod, meant to strike the rock in obedience, had instead been struck twice, an expression of human impatience rather than divine decree. The Lord's words had been clear, unwavering. Because you did not trust me enough to demonstrate my holiness to the Israelites at the waters of Meribah, you will not lead these people into the land I am giving them. The consequence, immutable and just, had been etched into the fabric of his destiny. He had accepted it then, with a heavy heart, and he accepted it now. His life's work was to bring his people to the Promised Land, not necessarily to dwell within it himself. He turned to watch Joshua, his chosen successor, a man of strength and wisdom, who moved among the people with an air of quiet confidence. Joshua's eyes met Moses's, and a flicker of understanding passed between them. There was no resentment, no bitterness in Moses's gaze, only a profound blessing. He had mentored Joshua, trained him, and now, he was entrusting the future into his capable hands. The transition, though tinged with Moses's personal sorrow, was a testament to God's foresight and the continuity of his plan. As the days turned into weeks, the initial frenzy of arrival began to settle into a more focused anticipation. The people were making preparations to cross the Jordan. The priests, carrying the Ark of the Covenant, stood ready at the water's edge. The river, swollen with the spring rains, presented a formidable barrier, a final test before their entry. Moses, standing on the high ground, observed the scene with a father's pride and a leader's concern. He had seen God part the Red Sea, he knew the Jordan would also yield. Yet, he also knew the people's deep-seated anxieties, the lingering fears that the wilderness had etched into their very beings. He called to him the elders, the leaders of the 12 tribes, their faces etched with the lines of years spent in service and struggle. He spoke to them not with the commanding tone of a ruler, but with the gentle wisdom of a patriarch. I am 120 years old today, he began, his voice resonating with the authority of experience, yet softened by the approaching end of his journey. I can no longer lead you. The Lord your God himself will go before you. He will not fail you or abandon you. He reminded them of the arduous path they had traversed, the countless times God had sustained them, the faithfulness that had marked their journey, even amidst their failings. He then turned his attention to the matter of inheritance, the distribution of the land that was soon to be theirs. He had already laid the groundwork, guiding the surveyors and scribes in their meticulous work. Now, he provided further instructions, ensuring that the divisions would be fair, that every tribe, every family, would receive their allotted portion according to the census and the promises made. He spoke of the importance of justice in these matters, of upholding the Lord's commands even in the distribution of earthly wealth. But the most poignant moment of his final days was his personal blessing upon each of the tribes. Standing before them, one by one, he invoked the spirit of prophecy, his words carrying the weight of divine inspiration. For Reuben, he spoke of their strength, but also warned of their instability, a lament for their scattered nature. For Simeon, he acknowledged their fierce nature, but foresaw their integration into Judah, their distinct identity absorbed for the sake of unity. To Levi, the priestly tribe, he bestowed a unique blessing of separation and service, their inheritance not land, but the privilege of ministering to the Lord and blessing his people. Their scattering was not a weakness, but a sign of their sacred duty. For Judah, the tribe that would carry the royal lineage, his words were filled with power and prophecy. He spoke of their strength, their lion-like ferocity, and foretold their preeminence, their dominion over their enemies. He painted a vivid picture of their future, a future that would encompass kings and a lasting legacy. For Zebulun, he foresaw their prosperity through trade and seafaring, their closeness to the sea a source of wealth and influence. For Issachar, a tribe known for its wisdom and knowledge of seasons, he spoke of their contentedness and their role as scholars. His blessings for Joseph, the tribe of his own ancestor through Ephraim and Manasseh, were particularly heartfelt. He spoke of the abundant harvest, the fertile land that would be their portion, a land blessed with the dew of heaven and the deep waters from beneath. He described their strength and their vast numbers, a testament to God's favor. For Benjamin, the youngest, he painted a picture of a fierce warrior, a wolf that devours its prey in the morning and divides the spoil in the evening, a tribe that would stand strong in the face of adversity. As he spoke of Asher, he foretold their wealth of rich food and royal delicacies, their land yielding a bounty of oil and fine produce. For Naphtali, he described a swift and graceful deer, a tribe blessed with beautiful fawns, a people known for their eloquent words. And finally, for Gad, he acknowledged their military prowess, their strength in battle, their willingness to fight for their brethren, their resilience in hardship. Each blessing was a prophecy, a glimpse into the future destiny of each lineage, woven into the grand tapestry of Israel's history. In his final address to the entire nation, Moses delivered a powerful discourse, reviewing their history, recounting God's faithfulness, and reiterating the terms of the covenant. He called heaven and earth to witness against them, a solemn reminder of the consequences of obedience and disobedience. He spoke of the blessings that would flow upon them if they followed God's commands and the curses that would befall them if they strayed. It was a somber yet vital farewell, a final impartation of wisdom and warning. He then looked out at the vast assembly, his heart filled with an overwhelming love for the people he had led for so long. He had seen their flaws, their rebellions, their constant need for divine intervention. But he had also witnessed their capacity for faith, their moments of profound devotion, their unshakable hope in God's promises. He knew that their journey was far from over. The conquest of Canaan would be a fierce and prolonged struggle. But he also knew that God's presence would go with them, that his strength would sustain them. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the plains, Moses, weary but at peace, made his way to Mount Nebo. It was a solitary ascent, a final pilgrimage to a place where he could stand and behold the land he had longed to enter. The air was still and quiet, the sounds of the camp fading into a distant murmur. He stood on the summit, the wind gently caressing his face, and looked out. The land lay before him, bathed in the golden light of dusk. Gilead, Naphtali, Ephraim, Manasseh, all of it, the land that God had promised to Abraham and his descendants. It was a sight of breathtaking beauty, a testament to God's enduring faithfulness. He saw the Jordan River winding its way through the landscape, the very river that separated him from his people's ultimate destination. He felt a profound sense of closure, a quiet acceptance of his fate. His work was done. He had fulfilled his commission. He had been the shepherd who guided the flock through the wilderness, and now, he delivered them to the watchful care of their new shepherd. The Lord's call came not as a thunderous command, but as a gentle whisper, a beckoning toward a different kind of promised land, a heavenly inheritance. Moses, with a final, contented sigh, laid down his earthly burdens. He had lived a life of extraordinary purpose, marked by both profound connection and ultimate separation. His legacy was not in the land he would never tread, but in the nation he had forged, the laws he had delivered, and the covenant that would bind them to God for all generations. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Moses, the greatest prophet and leader of Israel, entered into his eternal rest, his life a testament to unwavering faith and a reminder that sometimes, the greatest service is to prepare the way for others, even when we cannot walk the final steps ourselves. The stage was set, the leadership transferred, and the journey towards the promised land, under new guidance, was poised to continue. The hope that had sustained them through the long years in the wilderness was not extinguished with Moses' passing, but rather, it burned brighter, a beacon of God's unchanging faithfulness, ready to guide the next generation into the fulfillment of his ancient promise. Back matter. I wish to express my deepest gratitude to the scholars and historians whose tireless research and insightful interpretations of the Pentateuch have formed the bedrock of this narrative. Their dedication to illuminating the complexities of ancient Israelite society and the life of Moses has been an invaluable resource. I also thank my family and friends for their unwavering encouragement and patience throughout the writing process. The following appendix offers a brief overview of key geographical locations and historical periods relevant to this novel, aiding the reader in visualizing the journey and the setting of the Promised Land. Wilderness of Zin, the arid region where the Israelites sojourned for many years, characterized by scarcity and constant challenges. Mount Nebo, the mountain from which Moses was granted his final view of the Promised Land. Jordan River, the significant waterway forming the eastern border of Canaan, a final natural barrier before entering the land. Canaan, the ancient name for the land promised to Abraham and his descendants, encompassing the region west of the Jordan River. The Exodus, the foundational event of Israelite liberation from Egyptian bondage, spanning approximately 40 years. Manna, the divine food miraculously provided to the Israelites during their desert wanderings. Ark of the Covenant, a sacred chest containing the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments, symbolizing God's presence with Israel. Levites, the priestly tribe, set apart for service in the tabernacle and later the temple, with no specific land inheritance. Meribah, the site where Moses, in a moment of anger, struck the rock twice instead of speaking to it, leading to his prohibition from entering the Promised Land. Shema, the foundational declaration of Jewish faith, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Deuteronomy 6:4, often recited by Moses in his final teachings. This novel draws inspiration from the theological and historical accounts found within the Hebrew Bible, primarily the Book of Deuteronomy. Specific passages that inform the narrative include Deuteronomy 3:23-29, Moses' plea to enter the Promised Land. Deuteronomy 31:1-8, Moses' commissioning of Joshua. Deuteronomy 32:48-52, Moses' ascent to Mount Nebo. Deuteronomy 33:1-29, the final blessings of Moses upon the tribes of Israel. Numbers 20:1-13, the incident at the waters of Meribah. Michael Neal is a writer with a profound fascination for biblical history and the enduring power of faith. His work seeks to breathe life into ancient narratives, exploring the human heart amidst divine purpose. With a deep appreciation for the complexities of leadership and legacy, Michael Neal crafts stories that resonate with timeless themes of hope, perseverance, and the unwavering nature of God's promises. He resides in the Bay Area, where he continues to explore the intersections of history, spirituality, and storytelling.